The wind had a way of finding whatever skin a man forgot to cover. It came over the wall from a dark that never lifted, breathed thin ice into seams and stitches, pried at the black wool with patient fingers. Jon let it bite. He stood on the topmost walkway, hands sunk deep in his cloak, Ghost a pale wedge at his side, the direwolf's breath smoke against the starlight. From here the world fell away in silence. The haunted forest lay pressed flat as a page and inked with the faintest suggestions of trees. All the night's ink spilled in the north until the sky ran out of stars. He knew every sound Castle Black made in the hours when sleep had taken most of the men. The ropes creaked. The ravens muttered. A door thumped below, wood swollen with cold. Somewhere far along the wall, ice cracked with a noise like a trumpet, and the echo ran its cold braid through the stone before it died. And under it all, there was the whisper of his own breath. He rubbed a thumb along the soft place under Ghost's ear, and the wolf pressed into him and gave a small, content grunt, a sound Jon liked for the way it cast a circle against the emptiness. He waited without any sense of what he was waiting for, the way he had waited sometimes as a boy in Winterfell before a storm, listening to the strange hush in the world that came when clouds were still too far to see. A raven beat past like a thrown glove, skidding through the air and vanishing into the black west. Jon watched it go and thought of the birds in the rookery tucked warm in their narrow tower, each with a message inside it like a seed in a berry, messages that never came fast enough or went where they ought. He thought of the crisp, dry scrape of rough paper beneath his fingers and the way Maester Aemon's eyes had gone milky and bright when they spoke of dragons. He thought too of water, because he'd been dreaming of it for nights. He didn't want to tell himself the truth about those dreams, and so he didn't. He wrapped them in distance and put them on a high shelf. A river widened until it was the world. Its surface was a mirror to a low sun. It burned with that thin honey light he remembered from the rare autumn days when the cold had a sweetness to it. He could smell sunlight on water, clean metal in it, and he could see the green smear of willows along the shore and reeds bending in one rolling breath like a field of grain. He could hear something else too. A beat, not of wings, but the hint of a beat that someone else had brought close to his ear. When the wind knifed sharper, Ghost pushed his muzzle into Jon's palm as if to say enough of this, and Jon shook the snow from his cloak and started down the steps, his boots ringing on the iron. He didn't look back at the expanse of black woods. He preferred the honest mess of Castle Black to the smooth lie of distance. The yard was empty but for the shadow lantern light at the stable door and the thin music of a bit clinking. A mule stamped and made the wick light dance. Sam's window had a candle still, and Jon thought of the boy bent like a hook over his book and smiled without meaning to. He went to Maester Aemon first. It was habit as much as thought. The rookery smelled of straw and guano and the faint acid of old ink. The old man's room had the quiet of a church and the small emphasis of a fire that was kept alive out of respect rather than warmth. Aemon's head tilted at the sound of Jon's steps long before Jon touched the doorframe. "You should be sleeping," Aemon said, and the voice did that thing age will do to a voice when it is strong inside and the body cannot carry it, lifting and thinning and trembling all at once. Even the young must bargain with the cold. "I sleep enough," Jon said. The lie was so thin it had no weight. Aemon smiled in the direction of Jon's voice, his mouth making an elegant old man's curve out of nothing. "Crows do not sleep so much as roost," Aemon murmured. "They dream with open eyes. Tell me what yours are seeing." "You'll tell me it's nonsense," Jon replied, though he took a chair, because the taking of it made him feel younger and smaller and more honest. Ghost lay down with a heavy, pleased sigh and set his jaw upon his paws. "If I called nonsense what the world calls nonsense," Aemon said mildly, "I should have spoken very little in the last 90 years. The older I grow, the more I find nonsense to be a prophet in motley." Jon could not help himself. He laughed. It made him gentler with the words when they came. "It's a river, the one with 3 branches. The Trident," Aemon said, and his blind eyes went everywhere at once. "I know the sound of that water even here. They say it sings, if you stand in the right place. In the dream I stand above it," Jon went on. "So high I can't see the men on the banks. only the movement where they should be. The current shivers like a horse's hide. There's a heat in the cold, if that makes any sense. The air's in my chest like iron. I can't tell if I'm falling or flying. I think that's the difference between men, Eamon said. They name the same sensation falling or flying, and their lives go accordingly. The Trident has a way of dividing things. Rivers do. You know that from Winterfell. Jon thought of the bridge that arced over the stream by the old stone keep and how the water there had sounded in summer. A chuckle and chatter like women's talk, and in winter had been a slow croaking monster burdened by the ice that made a glass lip around its edges. He could cross it without ever noticing he had crossed. He could also stand on it and feel the life of the whole world pass under him. You know what else is on the Trident, he said, because he had to say it if only to hear it outside his head. Va. Eamon did not sigh. Sighing was for men with lungs enough to make a proper noise. He allowed the idea of a sigh to soften the skin around his mouth. As it ever is when kings grow numerous, there are better places for a king to be than in a man's mouth. Rob, Jon began and stopped at his brother's name, for the way it knotted the rope of his own oaths in his gut. He felt the twist of it until if he pressed his fingers there, he imagined he could feel the rope burn. There is love, Eamon said softly. There is duty. There is the place where they meet and the place where they cut. You know more of one cut than most boys. You told me once, Jon said, that there were 3 things men will go to war for: power, pride, and hunger. The 4th is love, Eamon said. But love wears the face of the first 3 when it thinks that might help. They sat with the fire making a sound like paper rubbed together. The ravens stirred. Somewhere above, one croaked dragon in a harsh, comical voice, a sound it had learned because men had taught it, not because it knew what it meant. Jon's skin went tight along his arms, and he scolded himself for it. Sam's been reading, he said to move the thought. He found something odd in a book from the bottom of a chest that looks as if it was forgotten there when Aegon was cudgeling the last of the giants loose from their caves. Sam reads the oddest things, Eamon agreed. Gods bless his eyes. What did he find? A story. He chose that small word deliberately. A tale about a Targaryen and a Stark. Not the ones they tell at the hearth when the snow amuses itself making shapes on the door. More like a list with names and dates and someone's board notes in the edges. It said that Aemon the Dragon Knight brought a gift north for a lord of Winterfell. It said the gift went to ground in the crypts because the lord's lady thought it ill luck to keep such a thing nearer the cradle than the grave. It said that later a prince riding north by a moonless road took the gift to be watched with the rest. Watchers, Aemon said. We love to call ourselves that, as if naming could save us from becoming actors. It could be nothing, Jon said quickly, and then felt his own eagerness like a heat. He had told himself the same thing. The book was old. Old books made mistakes or caught the whispers of drunk men or kept a joke like a moth in amber. A Stark would not keep such a thing in the crypt because it would be known. And if it were known, the South would have taken it from them or made a point of letting the North keep it while never letting them forget it. But the thought of the hot springs under Winterfell rose to him as if the water had steamed enough in his mind to make a cloud. Warm earth in a cold place made a man think mad thoughts. The way to find whether a thing is nothing is to go to it, Aemon said. But men are very clever at going everywhere but to the thing. It would be a strange business to go to Winterfell now, Jon said. He did not say impossible because the word had too much pride. Strange business is what ends wars while men are still busy counting how much grain is left in their storehouses. Aemon murmured, and then fell quiet as if sleep had taken him between one breath and the next. Jon waited and then saw the slow expansion of the thin old chest. When the maester opened his eyes again, he was nowhere near the room, and then he was fully in it. He lifted his chin as if wind had struck him. I am not a soothsayer. I cannot give you leave to break an oath nor ask you to lengthen yours beyond what it will bear. I can tell you that the world has grown very small. News of a boy with a wolf large enough to frighten horses would travel as quickly as a new bishop's blessing. Without the wall to stop it, the north would tumble down into the south at first thaw. What stops most things is not courage but distance. Dragons change distance. Jon didn't realize he had stood until Ghost lifted his head from his paws at the rasp of the chair leg. It was too cold to sweat, but his back stung in that way skin will when the blood goes thin under it. Dragons, he said, with the same distrustful caution a man used on a word like love. Eamon's mouth softened again, and this time there was no joke in it. I am very old. It is a comfort when something I never thought to see again makes a fool of me. Promise me you will sleep before dawn, and go to Sam. He will be waiting for the sound of your feet. Sam was waiting. Jon found him cross-legged on his narrow bed with the book half shut on his lap and his lips moving over a line he'd already read 3 times. The candle made his face look like a pale fruit with 2 soft bruises where his eyes were, and when he looked up he tried to smile so swiftly the effort went sideways. Did you go to Maester Eamon? Did you tell him? He pushed the book at Jon as if the words might run without a hurdle now that they had been named. Slowly, Jon said. Not to tease him, but because he knew the boy's breath would knot and the knot would make his voice crack. He sat and set the book on the blanket between them. It was heavy enough to make the straw tick sigh. Jon loved the tired, stubborn smell of old binding glue because it always made him think of secrets that didn't know they were secrets anymore. Only old stories and dust. Show me again. Sam flattened the book with a care that spoke of loving it too much to do so roughly. The page had a sheen to it from generations of fingers that had followed the same script. The note in the margin was fresher than the rest, though still browned. The hand made its letters with a tired little flourish, as if the writer had once cared very much about a fine curve and had since learned that ink and the world had other needs. Jon read the line he had read earlier and saw again the shape of the words about a gift and a lady who did not like the sound a dragon's name made in a nursery. It might have been a platter shaped like a dragon, Jon said. Oh, Sam said, disappointed and then relieved because Jon had given him a way to be sensible. Or a toy. They had the M in Old Town, a wooden thing painted red with small wheels. He fell quiet, then, because he was too good-hearted to let himself be sensible for long when his heart wanted the other thing. But why would a prince ride north with a toy in his saddlebags under no moon? The moon was shy, Jon said, smiling despite himself. Ghost thumped his tail twice and then put his head back down with his eyes still half open, as if keeping them half open was a compromise with the bother of other people's conversation. Jon tapped the note with a fingernail. This hand. It wrote the date of the snows that winter as if the snow had offended it. It kept the kind of count a steward keeps. Then the steward of Winterfell thought it worth writing, Sam said, in a tone that was almost reverent. Stewards write the things they think their lords might ask about someday. Sometimes the lords do. Mostly they never do. Jon let the book close and sat with his fingers linked so that the cold could sit in the ink lines and veins and he could feel his blood move. What would I do if it were true? He asked Sam without thinking whether Sam was the person he ought to ask. Sam looked as if Jon had asked him how the moon kept from falling. Then he looked as if Jon had set him a sum and a piece of chalk. You would tell the Lord Commander, he said. You would ask leave to go to Winterfell with a small party of men. He would refuse first because he is not a man who lets his mouth give in to his heart, and then he would consent because he is a man who knows the difference between a thing you want to do and a thing that asks to be done. He would say you were going to make certain of the men and grain the Starks pledged us. You would go with me because I read the script and because I would not forgive you if you left me behind. Jon looked down. He did not want to see the way Sam's hope lay bare on his face. And if there is only a platter shaped like a dragon? Then we come back with a platter and eat our bread from it, Sam said bravely, and Jon loved him then for his clumsy courage, as much as he loved anyone who could not throw his weight around in this brutal world and so learned to throw his heart instead. When the dawn came, it was a gray old woman fumbling with her shawl, light going wrong way by wrong way from the low hem of the clouds. Jeor Mormont heard the request and set his hands on the arms of his chair and closed his eyes for 3 measured counts before he answered. He refused, as Sam had said he would. He refused in that careful, simple language the Lord Commander used for matters that might in another man's mouth be anger. We are not a shuttle to run wool back and forth between Winterfell and the Wall. Then he refused in a different way, with a small hardness in his eye that said he had considered the other answers and rejected them. If it is a toy, you've wasted the strongest pair of shoulders I've got. If it isn't, you've brought me a tale to make drunk men laugh. Then he paused, his glance a shaved blade. And if it is what I don't want it to be, then you ask me to let one of my best boys go down into the riverlands while 3 or 4 foolish kings knock on doors with iron boots. I should have your tongue for a carpet if you had come to me with a pretty reason for wanting to ride south. That you come to me with an ugly one means you are less a boy than most. I don't want to go, Jon said, and the shock of realizing it made his pulse push at his temples and his mouth go dry. He wanted 10 different things all at once, and the sum of them was something like not wanting. He didn't want to leave the wall because leaving it felt like removing a brick and inviting the house to remember its own gravity. He didn't want to stay where each word that came from the south might have Robb's name in it with blood on both sides. Mormont heard that quiet honesty and leaned back a finger's width. You go with 4, he said finally. Don't take any man likely to be missed by his mother. Go as if the wind were watching you. Bring me a platter if there's a platter. Bring me foolishness if that's what you find, and I'll tell you it was a good errand to keep you from thinking too much about things you cannot change. But do not bring me a dragon. Gods keep us from a world small enough for dragons again. They left the next morning under a sky that had nowhere particular to go, and so loitered over the land with dirty wool tied to its wrist. Jon rode between Toad and Dolorous Ed and a laconic ranger whose name sounded like iron on iron. Sam rode awkwardly, slipping and correcting himself before the horse had noticed he was about to slip. The road across the gift was a brown, stubborn line, frozen where hooves struck it and soft where the cold had been clumsy. Ghost padded near the horses when the men talked and far from them when they were quiet. He had a way of becoming white noise against the snow until he moved, and all at once he was a story told to scare children. The journey took 3 full days because the horses were tired and the men stopped to mark changes in hedges and old walls, following their duty as if it were part of the errand to Winterfell and not the errand itself. It was good to be out from under the wall's shadow. Jon thought with a guilt he did not speak. The wall was a grave a man was blessed to live beside. It filled you with a particular seriousness. The roads made you feel as if the world were very wide and no one could be fixed long enough to be frightened of you. He forgot sometimes that he could smile. He smiled at Sam's story of the time he tried to clerk beside a scribe whose ink froze in the bottle between words, each sentence a small winter. They reached Winterfell on an afternoon pale as old silver. The smoke lay close to the slate roofs as if it were a creature that loved the stones and could not be persuaded to lift a foot, and the hot breath of the springs made everything they touched seem faintly alive. Jon closed his eyes as they passed under the gate. The smell of it went to his head like some sweet mead he'd drunk too fast. He saw for an instant the yard as it had been when the world was still the world. Bran's laughter, a bell, Rickon's tumble, Robb's shout of pleasure at the feel of a sword striking wood. The smith's hammer beat like a heart. Lord Robb is gone. A man told them who had no reason to tell it. He wears a crown now. Jon heard the effort the man made to keep himself from smiling. They went to the steward, who kept his count well and had the blank face of a man who counted not because numbers pleased him, but because something had to order him or he would crumble. The man spoke of grain and men and leverage on carts and the shape of winter's hunger when it arrived in a cold sack and would not leave. But he spoke with respect, and Jon left the room with relief curdled with shame. He had meant to be noble, and instead he had done what men always did in Winterfell. He had played at household. He went that night to the crypts. He couldn't not. The stone breathed cool air up onto his face as if it were a living thing that had responsibilities of its own to be up to. The statues looked as they always had, beasts guarding beasts, stone faces so unlike the flesh that had once contained them that men said the stone held the truth and the flesh the lie. Jon carried a lantern because he was not foolish and because he had always loved the smell of oil and the idea that he carried his light with him through the world rather than taking what the world cared to give. Ghost's pads were almost soundless on the steps. The wolf's tail brushed Jon's calf once and Jon was absurdly grateful to be touched. He walked among the statues until he did not know quite where he was in the long line of the dead. Because the important thing was not where he was, but how his heart moved when the light fell on the faces. The light slid across Lyanna's as if reluctant to be seen weeping. He did not speak her name. He traced his lantern along the base of her statue and on impulse set it between her feet. The sound came as he bent. It was small and mean and full of itself. A click behind the skin of the earth. Ghost's ears pricked, then flattened. Jon pressed his hand to the stone and for an instant felt its age like a creature under his palm. The second click came from inside the carved wolf that lay at Lyanna's feet. Then, faintly, there was a sigh, as if breath had been stored within and was now content to escape. Jon told himself to go slowly and did not listen. He leaned his shoulder into the stone and moved it enough to make a seam appear, then more than a seam. The carved beast tilted with a complaint of old hinges, and the way opened like a mouth speaking first word in a long time. The heat that struck him was not clean. It had a taste like iron and old soup and earth. The cavern mouth lay under the crypt like a second crypt, tunneled in some older time when the earth had been more generous or the men digging it more determined. Jon lifted the lantern. The light went down into terms the curve of the rock dictated. A slow fall that ended edge of sight and then widened again. He put his hand out to stop Ghost and then told himself he was a fool. The wolf slid past him and down, his tail level with his spine, his head low. Jon went after and the heat settled like a shawl over his head. The springs confessed themselves in puffs of steam that caught on the lantern's light and turned them into cautious ghosts. The path turned twice like an earthen screw and then broadened into a low room where the spring broke from a crack and ran a neat path it had made for itself over time into a pool like a drinking dish. The walls sweated. Jon had spent his boyhood running down here with Robb to play at castles while the servants looked the other way. He had never been in this room. The first thought was that he was wrong and this was a world of old men's tales and stew with too much onion. The second thought came with a smell. Something sweet beneath the mineral and the rot, something that made a filament in his nose tremble. Ghost went rigid, his nose up, and soundless, he bared his teeth. There was a shape in the far corner that was not rock. It was smoother and had a finish to it like the finish on a thing a man makes with his hands when he cares too much with a love that will not leave it alone. Jon went to it because he had to. The lantern found it and the world moved under his feet with the shock of the sight in a way that said he had not believed until this instant that he would ever see this. The egg was not quite the size of his torso. Its shell was not bright, but there was a patient sheen like the sheen on leather rubbed too often by a man's thumb. Its color made him think of a raven's shoulder where the slopes of the feathers went slaty. Its color made him think of the water under a winter sky when the ice was trying to remember the shape of the river beneath it. Patterns ran across the shell like scales, but no two scales were alike. Each caught the lantern differently and gave it back half returned. If it were a toy, it was a cruel one. When a man finds a story he's inside of, Jeor Mormont had said once, he'd best stop every few steps and spit and count his teeth, to be sure he's still a man. Jon did not spit. He had no spit in him. He set the lantern down very carefully and took a step and another. "Don't," he whispered, and only realized after that his whisper had been to himself. Ghost sniffed with a delicacy Jon had never seen in him, his nose barely moving. The wolf looked at Jon in a way that wasn't asking permission, and then looked at the egg as if the egg were a creature asleep and Ghost was deciding whether to nudge it with his nose the way he did with Jon's hand when he wanted attention. Jon laid his palm on the shell. It was hot, ot hot enough to scald, but hot enough to know what it was. The heat lay slow under the touch, not impatient. It breathed against his skin as if there were a hill under the shell and the hill was rising and falling. Jon found himself laughing once, a sound near tears' ally. "You're late," he said. It was a foolish thing to say and the right one. "You're years late. Your lifetime's late. Where were you when you were wanted, and where are you wanted now?" The egg did not answer because the world is not so generous. When he took his hand away, the heat remained like the memory of a woman's kiss on cold skin. Jon sat with his back to the wall and watched the thing that was not yet a thing grow no more and no less itself in the lantern's light. He could not map the time that passed. He remembered that he had men waiting above and that if he lingered, his absence would become a kind of lie. He remembered that nothing else in his whole life mattered for the space of 3 breaths. On the 3rd breath, he reached for the egg again. If he was to be a fool, let it be in daylight. He said nothing. He did not know the words men had said when the world was younger and there were more words to say. He pressed both hands to the shell where the sheen was deepest and closed his eyes and listened. Perhaps he believed he could hear something that was not there. Perhaps he was hearing something that had been there the whole time and had needed only a man to be quiet enough to let it be heard. He felt the heat climb him. It moved along his bones as if bones were roads men had laid down for that purpose long ago. He thought of Maester Eamon's blind eyes and of the way they saw past things. He thought of Lyanna's stone face and its sadness that never gave anyone else in the world permission to be sad. He thought of Eddard Stark's heavy hand on his shoulder and the way he had borne the weight like a boy making himself into a man by being still. He saw water. He smelled sun on water. He heard a beat not of wings and then he heard wings. The sound was nothing at first except the turning inside of something waking. The egg shivered like a horse quivering under flies. Ghost's lips peeled in a growl that was not anger. The tiny, irrational hairs along Jon's arms stood up as if to smell better. He didn't know he had cut himself until he felt the sting along his wrist where the shell had bite to it. A thin seam of red ran over his hand. One drop slid along his palm and fell to the base of the egg. It hung there, fat and impertinent, and then the shell took it. Jon was not a man for magic. He had been taught to think of it the way men think of summer snow, a thing the world tells to drunk men to make them quiet. But he saw that drop vanish, and he saw the shell respond and knew that this was either the beginning of a life or the end of something that had been waiting too long. The crack made no sound he had a word for. It was a dry, clear sound, and it felt like a winter moon seen through bare branches. Another followed. The egg broke according to a logic the egg knew and he did not, scales lifting in a spiral that made him think of a pinecone opening when the weather was right. The steam in the air thickened as if the room were breathing harder. A smell rose that made him think of the knife the cook used for onions when the metal was new and the onion old, and he almost laughed because the world never allowed men a single note without a second to mock it. The creature that came out of the egg was a ridiculous thing and a perfect one. It was smaller than the egg had made him expect and large in the way of a thought that had weight. Its wings were damp and it shook them once then twice and made a little affronted hiss when the cold air touched them. It blinked at him and the lids moved sideways and a little up and down and Jon felt his breath stop and then remember itself like a man in a cold river deciding either to swim or to die. The eye was not quite the black of ghosts. It had color in it like old wine. When it opened its mouth, the light showed the pale membrane there and the small, hard tongue. Its head moved with a surety that said, "I have always been alive. It is only you who only now have noticed." He reached a hand slowly and then slower still when the creature's head turned. It sniffed or did whatever the dragon version of a sniff was. His hand shook and he told himself it was only the cold. The small head touched his fingers and there was a fussy intelligence in the movement that reminded him of the way the blacksmith would test a blade. The dragon hissed at Ghost once, sound like a kettle. Ghost did not back up. He lowered his head and let the new thing learn his smell and made no more noise than a winter tree will when the wind moves in it. "Hello," Jon said. Because the only other words that pulled at his tongue were prayers, he didn't know how to finish and oaths he had already given away. "You're real." If there were any gods listening, they had been listening to this moment for longer than Jon had been alive. He thought then, not of Robb riding to war with a crown too heavy for his neck, nor of Joffrey with his pinched face, not of Stannis's blank stare that might yet move the world or of Renly's bright banners. He thought of distance collapsing like snow falling from a branch when touched. He thought of a world small enough for a boy with a wolf and a dragon to affect its shape. He stayed until the lantern began to gutter and the dragon had found the warmth by the water's edge and settled there with its belly flat and its chin on the stone like a dog. He wanted to touch it again and tell it what his hands had told his brothers when they were small. "Hush, here I am, don't be afraid, we are two things in a noisy world." But he was afraid that if he touched it he would not leave, and if he did not leave in the right way, the shape of everything above would change. He took the lantern and went up, and the cold hit him so hard he lost his breath and then found it again because he had to. He closed the carved wolf and only then realized he had not set it as exactly as he had found it. It looked right, and that would have to be enough. Ed and Toad were asleep. The ranger with the iron name sat near the fire with the patience of stone. He looked at John in that slow way men who live among trees learn to look. "Find your platter?" "I found something," John said. The man nodded. "Best not to tell me what. You've got eyes like a dog that's been told a secret it doesn't understand." He poked the fire, set a halved log with the hole toward the flame, watched how it burned differently, as if that were a prayer. "There's messages," he said after a while. "2 ravens in and 1 gone. The south's a hawk's nest with a weasel broke into it. Men who weren't kings are kings. Men who were kings sleep with stones over them. Your brother has done a brave thing and a foolish one. I don't know which will matter more in the end." John sat and held his hands to the fire and watched the skin there pink and then pale as the heat moved through him. He thought of the dragon below and went cold again. He told himself he would go back at dawn without the men, as if going at dawn without the men would make his trespass less of a trespass. He slept an hour, perhaps 2, and dreamt of minnows in a brown stream with sunlight on their backs so that each fish in passing looked like a coin. He woke and went. He brought meat because it felt right even if it was stupid. He brought meat because he could not stop himself. The creature took what he gave it without gratitude and with something that was not ingratitude either. It lived and living things eat. It snapped and the movement was so fast the light couldn't count it. It settled near his knee with the meat between its forelimbs and went at the food with neat ferocity, bones snapping under that neatness as if bones were bread. John did not speak. He took off 1 glove and set his hand on the damp wing, and the body heat went into his palm with a surety that almost made him faint. It was like touching a forge where someone had left a blade. He raised his hand and the small head went to it like iron to a lodestone. Wait, he told himself, because the part of him that liked to count knew this was a thing that would not be waited out by a man's patience or impatience. His impatience was a gnat here. Wait, prepare. Count years in months and months in days and then in hours. He had to make a space in a world for a thing that did not yet know what space meant. He went up when the regular world needed him. He counted grain with the steward, watched the smith's face. Micken's hands were his one comfort in that day, because they were hands that knew what to do in response to need. John sent the other men to their tasks and stole Sam when he could. He took Sam down to the crypts as if he were taking a child to see the first snow. Sam cried almost immediately and then gulped his tears down because he wanted to listen, and tears near his ears always made it hard to hear. The dragon blinked at Sam's wet face and sneezed so suddenly that both boys began to laugh and could not stop until their bellies hurt. "Is it wrong?" Sam said finally, hiccuping. "That I love it already? It's wrong to think love has rules," John said, because he had to say something that had the shape of wisdom even if it had no weight. They named the creature without meaning to. It answered to nothing at first because it did not need to. Then John said a word without thinking and the word stuck. Later he could not say why. Perhaps the dragon turned its head a certain way when he spoke and that made him think of a thing he had once seen. Perhaps the name was waiting under his tongue like a taste. Frostfire, he called it, and at once disliked the pomp of it and loved the etymology. Winter and heat made into a single breath. Frost for the north of his blood, fire for the rest if there was a rest to claim. The next morning he called again it, and the creature lifted its head as if answering. It pleased Sam to have a proper name for the thing he loved. It frightened John and comforted him in equal measure. If anyone asked why he kept going to the crypts, John had a dozen honest reasons for the going. None were true. He went because he had found a new life, and his body, which had learned the shape of the wall and hunger and duty, now had to learn the shape of astonishment. He went because he had feared and admired dragons as words for too long, and he knew that until he put his hands on the fact, he would be unsteady. He went because he had woken many mornings with a feeling like a hungering under his breastbone he had never been able to feed. A week passed, then 2. The world went about its business with an impatience that felt like the impatience of an ant, hill Jon had once put his boot down near and watched. Men shouted and slept and screwed and died and paid and lied and told truths that served them as lies do other men. He forced himself to eat. He slept so odd hours that the black was thrown into bad-tempered knots because they clattered into him at times when a man ought not be clattered into. He watched Frostfire's bones make answers under its skin. He went to the smith and came away with leather and a willingness to be thought mad. The first harness was a parody of a saddle, patterned on horse gear and improved by nothing but stubbornness. It did not fit a back that moved like a live thought. The second was better. Mikken watched Jon's hands betraying themselves in their eagerness and said nothing because the castle was changing around him and men who had been boys yesterday arrived today with ideas in their mouths. The third harness took a piece of the old hawk's jesses that had hung in the mews since a lord with a taste for the sport had died before he had taught his son how to tie them. It had a way of balancing tension against release. Jon slept with the leather near him as if the smell could teach him what patience could not. Frostfire grew. The way it grew frightened reason. He took meat and took meat again, and the meat vanished into length and weight and a surety in his eyes. Sam said that words in books were like crumbs you followed, and sometimes the crumbs led you to a shelf too high for your hands. He told Jon shyly that dragons learned their riders as much as riders learned them, and that men who thought otherwise eventually fell. Jon learned the way the beast liked a hand along the curve where wing met body, learned that the head would turn to the left first, learned that a sound at a certain pitch would make its head cock like a curious dog's, and learned too that no sound he had any right to make could make Frostfire do what it did not wish to do. He did not yet speak to the Lord Commander. He told himself that the right words needed to be gathered as you might gather the nuts that would save you in a winter. To go up with only a few words was to die. He also told himself a harder thing, that if he spoke the right sentence in the wrong room, Frostfire would be killed, and perhaps by him, because the fate this creature had given him was heavier than any oath he had ever taken and might require of him things his father would have been ashamed to ask. A raven came. It said little with its ink, but said a great deal in what it did not say. It said that Renly was a ghost and kings were now 3 not 4. It said that the Riverlands had become a word to frighten old women, and Ironborn had been seen doing what Ironborn did when gods weren't watching. It said that Tywin Lannister's men had learned the set of the Trident's banks and moved there as if those banks had invited them, and that Robb Starr kept moving in ways that made old banners tremble, and that Stannis had talked half the sea into his cause and was talking to the other half. Sam read the words and kept his face like a novice at prayer, trying not to fart. Jon folded the parchment and breathed in. He pictured the river again without meaning to. This time when he looked down there was a shadow on it, and he knew it was them. Gior must be told, Sam whispered, and then because he loved Jon, he lied unconvincingly. Perhaps we can keep one thing secret and speak another. You cannot tell half a secret, Jon said. That's how men tell gossip. So he went and told Gior Mormont that he had taken leave of and then come back to his senses, and that he had found something he ought not have found and could not in any decent world ignore. He told him badly, as men tell things they want despised by themselves to sound worse in another man's mouth, so that he will finish the work. Mormont listened with his face like a rock and then stood and put his hands on the table as if the table were the back of a horse and he were about to mount. "Show me," the Lord Commander said. Jon had feared that. He took Mormont down. The wolf sound came first and then the little noise Mormont made when he saw. It was like what a man says when a woman takes off her clothes, if he loves her and did not know he loved her until that moment. "Gods make us all fools," Mormont said, and he laughed, a small, sincere laugh that made Jon love him and fear him. "You have a problem, Snow. It is now our problem. I will not say we are not alive for problems. That is the work. But I am too old to enjoy this one. What will you do?" Jon asked, and all the boy in his voice humiliated him. Mormont squatted with a groan and made a noise in his throat as if he had a stone lodged there. Frostfire regarded him with half-lidded contempt, as creatures do when they understand that you understand them. "I will do what a man does when a fire starts in the corner of his barn. I won't set water to the whole of it if I can divert the flame to something that ought to be burned anyway." Jon only looked at him. "We have enemies," Mormont said. "We have duties that are not the ones we took oaths for. but are the ones those oaths were meant to teach us to bear. There are wars to the south. There are things to the north that make those wars into children's fights over apples. This beast," and he jerked his chin, "tells me my world is now small enough that everything will shortly be my business whether I want it or not. The trick will be to choose which business to share." The next days moved fast and were swallowed and moved faster in turn. Mormont called no council because men who like councils are men who like noise. He spoke instead to men whose opinions mattered because they would get on with things. He set eyes on the gate guards and told them the crypts were no one's business but his. He told the kitchen to send down enough meat to feed a small garrison of sworn brothers whose appetite had turned suspicious. He instructed the smith to finish that nonsensical harness if finishing it would make the boy stop fiddling with the straps and perhaps sleep more like the rest of the world and less like a fox. He called John to him when the light outside had the clean edge it gets on days when the cold feels proud of its work. "You have to ride it," he said, "and you have to ride it where it will end something and not begin it." John did not ask how. He had made of his nights a language with the dragon. He knew the twitch of the tail and the set of the eyes. He had stood under those wings and felt their shadow roll across him like an answer to a question he had not been clever enough to pose. He had fed the creature with his hands and watched the teeth and trusted in a way his body protested. He had no choice but to trust. He would be broken if he did not. "Don't be brave," Mormont said then, surprising him. "Be right if you can. If you cannot, be unlucky in the right direction." They chose night because night was a lie that could sometimes be made into a truth. John set the harness with hands steady despite himself. Sam's breath was in his ear with the little sob it made when he wouldn't let himself cry. Ghost stood square and endorsed nothing and everything. Frostfire's eyes had the look of a man who had seen something he could not unsee and was pleased to have seen it. John slid his leg over and the beast told him in a dozen little ways that he was an idiot. He flinched. He settled. He let his weight be heavier where it should and lighter where it must. He reminded himself that saddle and strap were to make him honest about falling, not to make him proud about holding on. He put his hands on the line he had taught the harness to be and breathed in and out again, and the whole of the world condensed to the length of his own arm, and the smell of steam and oil and hot stone, and the sound of Sam's breath and the great, folding rush of wing. They did not leap so much as stop belonging to the ground. The earth yielded them like a friend who understands why you must go. The air was what it had always been, a thing to be moved through and not examined. It woke them the way cold water wakes a man who thought he had been awake, and particulars came to him in order. His face hurt from the wind. His chest knew about itself to the very last branch of whatever tree a man's chest was. He did not know Frostfire's mind, but he felt a satisfaction under him that had no vanity in it. They had been wrong. Gravity did not hold kingship over all things. They were over the yard, and then the gate, and then the fields with their rime and their old walls. The men below were not ready to have the world cut across like that. Someone shouted. A horse reared, and a man fell under it and was unhurt and laughed because the fright made him feel that he was not yet dead. John heard the laugh and felt it go through his bones. Then the ground fell away as the land does not often fall, and the wall rose against the stars like a man rising from his chair to show that though he had sat long, he was still tall. Frostfire worked, and the sound of those wings took on a rhythm that put John's heart to work the same way. John learned in a dozen seconds what would have taken him 100 pages to describe wrong. You leaned because the beast leaned. You did not tug. You asked and you were heard, or you were ignored. If you were ignored, you did not punish an animal that ignored you, because animals have their reasons and punishment is a language dragons do not speak in. He learned the flex and relaxation of the back. He learned to let go. The first time he looked down, he nearly fell only because his body had expected it at last to be allowed to fall. He was over the black press of wood that belonged north of the wall, and then over the white of the wall itself where the moon put her waist light and made gold of the frost at the edge of the top. Men were lines there, and lines of those lines were lives. He looked away and then looked again, because men always look at what will change them. He saw the shape of the land as he had never seen it, how the hills did or didn't push the wind, how a river takes what the land gives and returns it a little worse for the wear. They flew until his mouth was cut with cold, and he had forgotten his own name in the rush of it, and then Frostfire decided the night had proven enough. The dragon made a noise like satisfaction and obliged gravity to remember its work. There was a roughness to the landing like the roughness to waking. It brought with it the ache a man gets when he realizes he has a body again and must return to it. Jon slid down, and then his knees betrayed him and he laughed into the dark because laughing was the only answer he had to that kind of fear. Sam was crying openly now and did not care. Ghost came and pressed his head into Jon's thigh like a loaf of warm bread. Jon leaned his forehead to the dragon's hot cheek and then stepped back because there were laws here he had not written and could not break without paying. He wanted to be modest before that heat. He wanted to be respectful to the physics of this new kingdom. He did not sleep that night. He stood over the map table with Jeor Mormont, and their breath put weak fogs over the tiny hills and painted rivers and all the commandments men had written about where and where not you could travel. They spoke very little. They moved pebbles and counters and small carved men whose swords outstripped their courage by a thumb length. The trident looked like it always had, like a fork that could go in a mouth or in a man's eye depending on who held it. "We can end a thing," Mormont said, "by stopping it in the middle. Sometimes that's the only way. Men despise it because it makes nobody a hero and everybody a fool. But the ground doesn't care what men despise. It cares where the blood goes and then what grows in the blood. If you can choose where the blood goes, you become a kind of farmer." "What if I cannot choose?" Jon asked. "Then you define the error," the old man said. "Sometimes that's more beautiful than the answer. It would have been brave and wrong to leave the next day." They waited, and that was right, and Jon learned that a man with a dragon cannot afford to act like a boy who has found a sword. He learned the slowness that an army learns that loses more by moving fast than it gains. He flew at night because the creature liked night, or because Jon liked night and the dragon liked Jon's liking. He learned the shapes of the trees from above and the way the snow made meaning on the ground. He learned the new language his body had begun to speak. The ache in his thighs and the soreness in his back that told him he had begun to build a different kind of strength than a swordsman's. He learned to sleep again because exhaustion is a kind teacher. Word from the Riverlands kept pace with his lessons. They fell into that rhythm men fall into with disaster. There was news in the morning and news at night, and between the two the day tried to be human and failed. The Trident's banks were trampled and men had made small walls and larger ones and then made less of them. Catelyn Stark's name came like rain, Tywin's like a drum. The Ironborn gnawed at the north's edges like rats removing mortar. Stannis' fleet was a rumor of thunder rolling up from the south, and Dragonstone had become a word men put on their tongues like a coin to test. When the thought came, it came clean. I could end this. It came without trumpets and without vanity. It came as recognition, the way a man recognizes a face in a crowd and thinks only, "Of course, there you are." He found Mormont and said simply, "It is time." He expected the old man to chastise him for dramatics. Jeor Mormont only looked at him and moved a small stone 1 inch to the right on the map and said, "Yes." He did not tell the other men. He did not say farewell. He took Sam's hand briefly and met the boy's eyes, and they both said nothing because words would either fill the space where they needed quiet or empty it of the thing they wished to keep. He went down to Frostfire, and the dragon set his weight and taught the ground as much as Jon did that they were leaving it. They rose into that home that wasn't a home but would do, and the cold loved them for their audacity and bit them like brothers. They flew not south merely, but along the line of habit the land had, and then out of it. They took the air over the barrows and the crescents of old earthwork, and Jon remembered the ant hill he had teased with his boot. He crossed the neck, and the world changed its dialect. The crannigs lay like patient animals sleeping in green water, and the air smelled different. Green rot and wet bark. He saw men there sometimes, small as answers, moving with a slant and a grace as if the land were full of traps that they had been taught to love. He saw a thin fire and thought, with a sudden, ridiculous homesickness, of the smell of onions on a knife. They came down once in a place that was more suggestion than land, where grass grew on water and the water laughed at the idea of being called a lake. He did not see the man until the man chose to be seen. He had eyes like old leaves, and they took Jon in and took Frostfire in and made no more noise in their seeing than a tree would. He said Jon's name as a fact rather than a greeting. "I have been wanting to speak to you," he said. Jon lifted his chin in the way he had learned to, not proud, not humble. "Then you should have sent a raven." "They don't like it here," the man said, and his smile was a sliver blade. "The air won't carry them far. It's too thick with secrets." Ghost's ears turned toward the man and then away again, in a way that said, "Yes, this is a friend of a kind." Frostfire flared his nostrils at the smell of green water and sent a small snort of steam toward the man as if to test whether he would startle. He didn't. He came closer and set his hand on the dragon's flank without fear, as if he were placing a palm to a horse or a stone. "You know me," Jon said. The man nodded. "How?" "By the shape of you," he said. "You wear 2 lives and pretend you can bear them as easily as you bear 2 names. That makes you both heavier and lighter than men suppose. We see things other men don't because the grass teaches us to watch what it hides." "You knew my father," Jon said, and the man nodded again and then, because he was not a courtier, did not make Jon beg for the rest by refusing it. "I knew his brother," he said, "and his sister. I was at the place where one life was bartered for another. That is a kind of seeing a man does not forget. I have kept that seeing secret because men love to use a truth like a knife. I tell it to you now, not because I think you have a right to it, but because the world needs that truth in your bones to do what you aim to do next without breaking yourself in two." The water made a soft slurping noise as it took a reed away. The dragon's eye moved and put the man's small figure in its seeing, and then had done with him and looked elsewhere, because dragons deal in measure larger than men. "Tell me," Jon said, and the way he said it was plea and command and prayer. "Men are very fond of fathers," the man said, with a softness that had no mockery. "They forget that mothers bear truths whole for months and then bleed to make those truths into boys who will look at maps and think they understand the shapes. Your mother did not have time enough to do the telling. I say her name as a thing that can now be said, because it may give you a little more winter to spend. Lyanna." Jon had known it all and none of it. He stumbled and then he did not. He let himself be altered. He felt, briefly, that he was holding 2 heavy stones with his heart, and then he put one down because no man can carry 2 forever. "And the other truth," the man said, as you might say, "and now the weather. Your father's face was not the one you have spoken in your head as father. He was a man who sang as if a sword might sing. He was a man who would have liked to talk to you about the names men give to things when they want to pretend their decisions are songs and not mathematics. You carry him whether you want to or not. If you go to the Trident blind to this, you will drown in the numbers. Go knowing and the sums change. The ugly truth can be a bridge." Jon's breath left him and returned again and did so twice more before he could speak. "It may not matter," he said. "It may only be a story that makes a boy feel as if his life were a book instead of a stove. It matters to a world that thinks it has 5 kings," the man said mildly. "It matters to the men who will die trying to make a point. It matters to the people who want to make a life instead of a point. It matters because your own life matters. No story lasts if you break the boy in the middle of it. Don't break." Jon wanted to ask about love and vows and whether human beings had been invented to measure the gap between them. He wanted to ask if his enemy's shape looked different from the air and whether that would make it harder to strike. He wanted to ask if the man had known his mother's laugh. He asked none of those things. He said, rather, "Will you tell anyone else?" The man shook his head. "Secrets have their seasons. This one will ripen more quickly in your chest than in anyone else's mouth." Jon bowed because no other gesture would express both gratitude and the ache of it. He climbed back up with the harness's help as if the harness had been made to increase his dignity. It had not. Frostfire sprang, and the air took them again because the air liked anything that defied the ground. The north fell behind, and if Jon had ever thought it would be hard to leave what he had loved, the dragon made leaving a fact of physics and not of heart. The land did not wail. It rolled under them, and the men on it made quarrels and bargains and died well and badly, and the maps would record none of it. The maps only recorded where things were, and only roughly. They caught the Trident in an evening like an afterthought. The river's 3 branches were drawn in cleanly, as if a careful hand had been there with a knife. The sun had gone low enough to give everything an edge. Smoke lay along the west bank like a fur stinking of the animal that had once worn it. In the air, heat and the smell of cooked grain and the faint, miserable note of fear made a broth even a dragon could smell. Frostfire answered, and a low sound came from inside the creature's chest and moved through Jon's bones into his teeth. He took them higher and the world widened again. The camps below made an ugly pattern that the river tried to domesticate. The banners were unrolled and their colors were not colors but shapes. Men do that to colors when they hate and when they want to be called home if they live. He saw a Lannister lion and a Tully trout, and the leanness of the wolves and the sunburst Renly's men still flew out of stubborn grief, and the stags that were left for men who liked to pretend they carried a king in their pocket. The sight made him dizzy with the math of it. He could cook this whole sum. He could drop fire on them and the river would take it and spread it, and men would die and grass would smell sweet later in a way that would make the living sick. He could destroy them and call it ending a war. It would not be wrong. He did not want to be right that way. He worked along the line of the river. He watched the men in motion and the men in stillness. He watched the vanguard and the fat belly of the army where cooks made porridge and talked in jokes because jokes keep men from understanding what they are doing. He watched, too, the faces, because from above you can see faces if you look for them. You see men caught in some thought that will not survive the hour. He saw a boy run with water skin and then look up because dragons compel men's eyes. He did not know if he meant to frighten them or make them look. He knew he could speak a language from the air that no man on the ground could speak back. He let the dragon's cry go. It broke the sky. The sound laid a hand on the water and the water shivered. Men dropped and then stood again, and some ran and then turned to laugh because the running had been unmanly. Horses scattered and then collected their fright and took it with them to their men, where it made a mess of everything. He did not want to kill, not like this. He wanted to vow. He wanted to make a shape in the air and say, "There is a different kind of sentence available." He wanted to force the word parley into mouth stuffed with iron. He sent frostfire cutting across the lines. He felt arrows rise and fall uselessly and knew where the skill lay and where it hadn't been nourished. He drove them toward the center of the Trident, where the 3 branches fought for the honor of being one river. He felt the pull of it and used it. He let the dragon's shadow choose a piece of ground with the stubbornness to hold a man's feet steady, and then he called his aim and made the world focus on one spot, the way a glass bends light into a single white cruelty that can set leaves on fire. He chose a sandbar, a place where no man's banner had declared itself home and no man's lover would later say, "He died at my doorstep." He let frostfire drop and the dragon set down with an indignation that made the sand move. The camp noise changed. The river allowed itself a new piece of music. Silence. It was the aggressive silence a room makes when a man enters whom everyone must look at. Jon slid off and pushed his hair back and did not try to make himself fair. He did not lift a sword. He did not take off his gloves, because the gloves were the last thing keeping his hands from shaking with the necessary shock of what he was doing. He stood with the dragon behind him and the river in front and felt he was the hinge on which a heavy, old door turned. He watched men come like colors sorted by a patient child. Blue and gold, red and dirty brown, and stark gray like honest wool. He saw the prickly surgeons of both armies pause with their knives and bits of string and watch. He counted breaths. He counted heartbeats. He did not speak until the men with crowns among them appeared. Not all, never all, because kings have a way of not being where the ground will need to be explained to their widows. But enough. He saw Robb, thinner than he wanted him to be at the jaw and wider in the shoulders and old in the eyes in a way that humiliated Jon anew with love. He saw a red cloth banner arranged as if it were a man, and Tywin's men near it with that patient meanness about them that said their master had taught them to let bread go stale so it would cut better in the mouth. He saw a man with Stannis's favor and Stannis's angry, practicing will in his posture and steadiness. He saw Catelyn Stark, not in the front because she would not put herself there, but a half step back and holding everything together with the machinery in herself that refused to break even when sorrow begged it to. Jon lifted his hands. He had no authority to lift them. Authority is only the art of lifting your hands and making men think they have been raised from their own chest by their own thought. He let his fingers open. He made no grand arm spread. He let the river do the work of carrying his small human voice. He said, "Enough." And the word landed on the water like a pebble, and the water carried the ripples to the banks in both directions. Men don't obey a single word, not even from dragons. They obey the meaning they decide to pour into it. He waited. In waiting there was a risk, the first madness. A man with a bow or a panicked boy with a spear, a hero with a life that required a heroic ending. He felt the wind's finger on the back of his neck and trusted that for whatever reason, he would not die in this instant. He had no idea why he trusted that, only that not trusting it would make him foolish and dead. He lifted his voice a second time. "Bring your lords. Bring your ties and your knives and your quills. Bring everything you use to end a thing. I have another way to end it." That was an arrogance, and men bristled as they have a right to bristle. It is not a small thing to arrive from the sky and talk as if the earth were your carpet. He did not apologize. Apology would cheapen it, and he did not know how to make this cheap and still make it theirs. He did not look at Rob, because if he looked at Rob he would ask to be forgiven for something, and he did not know what yet. He looked instead at the men with the careful faces who would decide if they could make profit from this without calling it profit. The Lannister envoy with his neat little steward's satchel. The man with the stag pin counting in his head the ships he did and did not have. The one with the trout on his breast who wanted very much to be wise because his children believed he was. He gave them time to come because making men move fast in the wrong direction was a sin. He stood on a sandbar while frost worked its way up from the river into the soles of his boots. He let the cold have him as men made their politics inside their own skulls. He felt Frostfire's heat behind him and thought about walking backward into that heat and lying down on it like a man who has been given a fire on a cold night. He did not. He held his place. When they stood before him, he saw that half what he had wanted he had been given by accident. They had brought scribes. They had brought men who had no particular desire to die. They had brought men whose gods had finally become tired of being asked to pick sides and now desired a nap. They had not brought Joffrey, because the Boy King did not like being asked to come where he might be told he was afraid. They had not brought Stannis, because Stannis's manner of loving justice sometimes required that he refused to come where justice might be negotiated. They had not brought Robb into the absolute front, because his people loved him too well to make him meet. They had brought what you always bring to the edge of a river, witnesses. "What are you?" someone shouted, but not cruelly, not exactly. It was a sensible question. The voice was of a man who had lived long enough to see some things he wished he had not, and who now wanted to know if seeing this was worthy of adding to his catalog. "Cold," Jon said, and the river liked it and repeated him. There was laughter, but not too much. "Whose man are you with that beast?" Another wanted to know, and this one had a boy's impatience in his mouth. "Mine," Jon said, and then corrected himself. "I am his. We have an arrangement." "That's not comfort," came from the Lannister not, and it didn't sound as if the man meant for anyone to hear him say it. "Comfort is what you find in blankets," Jon said. "We'll see if there's any left by dusk, when this decided." "What is this?" It was Catelyn Stark who spoke now, in a voice so even it made other voices hush. She had the kind of authority a river has when it narrows. "What do you think can be decided here, Jon Snow?" He should have braced for the name. He had expected the blow, and still it went through him, because names make men boys again in ways that have nothing to do with the shape of their bodies. He bowed to her. He did not say mother, no gods, never that. He did not say anything that would make a sound he would later wish he had not heard coming from his own mouth. "We can decide how to end a killing that no one has time for. We can decide how to take men out of the math. We can decide who will sit in chairs and who will go to the wall and who will go home to wives and who will go to earth. We can decide to be tired together instead of proud separately." It wasn't a speech that would live in a song. It wasn't the kind of sentence that men write down and later carve into stones between unlikely plants. It landed the way a loaf of bread lands, heavily and with a crackle. At the edge of the Lannister cluster, a man Jon did not know put his hand over his face as if to hide how weary he was of making it look otherwise. Beside the Tully man, a scribe bit off the end of his quill and spat it out, forgetting to pretend he did not do that when women were present. A horse somewhere blew out and shook its head and made an impatient clacking with its bit. "You're a boy," someone said. And this time the contempt was simple and clear. Jon did not pretend otherwise. He also did not say, "I have a dragon," as if dragons made men. "And you are old," he said, and heard the river like it. "Men can be different things and still be right. I am not here to be a king. I am here to make you tired enough to sit down." He had judged correctly that there was a kind of man with a kind of exhaustion that would take offense at a dragon, and a kind of other man whose exhaustion could only be met properly by the sight of a dragon to shake everything into a new arrangement so that sitting seemed a daring act. He understood all at once that ending a war is usually a matter not of killing but of terrifying and then providing a chair. Terms, called the Stannis envoy. "You must have terms to make that voice and bring that beast and take this sandbar." "Yes," Jon said, and heard all the men lean in a little. "You will bring your prisoners. You will bring your guilt. You will bring the names you do not speak. You will bring, too, a readiness to be minor in the story that is going to be told later, so that the story may be larger than any of you. You will bring those things, and I will bring fire for the things that must burn. And then you will go home to what is left and see if you can persuade your gods to let you keep it." "You speak as if the gods are a purse we lift," someone muttered. "I speak as if the gods are tired of listening to the wrong kind of prayer," Jon said, and then he lifted his hand and Frostfire stretched and ruffled the air and laid heat over the men like a promise. It was enough. It had to be. He did not think then of everything that might follow, of what it would mean to stand on a river and make men agree to unsay some of what they had been. He did not think then of what it would mean to persuade proud houses and mothers and prides. He thought of the cold under his sawls and the heat against his back and of Ghost standing at the river's edge, immaculate and unafraid, as if to show all these men what it meant to belong entirely to one's own life. He thought of Lyanna and of Rhaegar without saying their names even in his own skull. He thought, too, of Jeor Mormont at the table in the cold, moving a stone an inch to the right to demonstrate half a kingdom's worth of thinking. "Terms," he said again, and the river carried the word up both arms and into the hands of men who suddenly had nothing else to do that would make sense. "Bring them and be fast. The sun does not owe us any overtime." They brought them. They brought grudges that had been sharpened for months and looked at the edge and agreed, grudgingly, to set them down. They brought men with ropes around them and, under Jon's hard eye, cut those ropes so that his terms could be spoken to free men and not to things. They brought pen and ink because men always think ink is how you fix things that you've broken openly with blood. They brought women with faces like walls with windows in them to look through and a little breath coming out. They brought a boy who put his little hand on the dragon's back and cried when the heat burned him just enough, and then held his burnt hand to his chest and felt proud because he now had a story to tell the rest of his life. They brought arguments. They brought wise sayings. They brought their old gods in their heads, and Jon watched the gods stand aside in exhaustion and let men write with their own small fingers. He stood and he listened, and he made a gesture here and a cut there. He told the Stannis man no twice until it became a yes, because the man saw that his no had been posturing and hated that about himself in a way Jon could respect. He watched the Lannister steward sweat and remembered that men like that are often how the world is held together in the parts of the day when nobody wants to make a decision. He looked at Robb finally, and held the look as if it were a blade they were both taking equal care to touch. They were not brothers now. They were not anything but two men whose childhood had ended on different afternoons. The look held and said what they could not say aloud, because if you say such things aloud in front of enemies, you must then make poems and never be allowed to sleep again. By the time the sun had found the froth at the edge of the water and gilded it, and then remembered that night was a thing it had to do and went to do it, the terms were written. They would be torn and patched, and some ignored and some made into songs. They would be called treachery by men who had no stakes in them. They would be called mercy by men who needed to learn to grow vegetables. They were enough. Jon did not smile. He only felt the place under his ribs where he'd been keeping fear unclench in the slow way your hand does when it has held a too heavy thing for too long. He climbed up and did not trip. He would not give that to anyone's memory of this day. Frostfire's wings swept a clumsy tent and sent it across the sand into the river, where it became a joke all along the bank, and men laughed too long in relief and held their sides like old men. They lifted. The river breathed under them. The men raised their faces and the dragon's shadow crossed them, and for a second each one of them looked as if a cloud had noticed him specifically. Jon glanced at Robb again and saw his brother lift his hand half a finger, the way he had lifted a finger when they were boys to see if the other would follow. Jon did not, because following is for boys and he was not allowed to be one now. He went into the sky and let the air take the heat from around him, and felt that between the heat and the cold a man might make a life. Behind him the river went on doing what rivers do, changing everything without making noise about it. The terms would spread. Fast where men were afraid, and slow where men were proud, and not at all where men liked to hoard their dead. He did not let his mind try and measure what he had done with numbers. He counted breaths again, in and out, and Frostfire's wings did the larger counting. They would say later that a boy on a dragon had ended a war in an afternoon on the Trident, and it would be true the way stories are true. It would not be the whole of the truth, which was made of ink and bread and a river and 100 men not looking one another in the eye and deciding to, and a woman's steady voice, and a brother's face an inch older than the last time you saw it. He had not burned them. He had promised to do so if necessary, and sometimes that is what you need to promise to be allowed to stop promising anything else. Night rose to meet them, and the dragon was content. Jon felt the ache in his thighs, the weariness and the hunger, and loved his body for the way it had become the instrument of this day. He thought of the wall and of Ghost and of Sam, who would ask sensibly how he would now keep all these things he had unbalanced from tearing the shelf off the wall. He thought of Jeor Mormont and the small precise movement of the stone on the map. You move a thing an inch, you look at men, you let them tell you if you've moved it in the right direction, and then you move it again. He thought also, unavoidably, of truth and what the man in the marsh had put in his hands. He turned it over in his head as the stars came harder one by one, and decided to put it down for now because truth is a tool, not a flag. The world had time yet for him to climb onto that bridge. He would hold himself together for a while with what he had. He had a dragon. He had the cold. He had the ground. He had the memory of a river making a sound like patience as men did their unusual business on its bank. He was not proud. He was tired. He let the tiredness settle into him the way a cloak does when you are finally inside and you can peel the wet one off. He turned Frostfire's head a little north to feel what the air felt like there, and to think and to be a boy for a few heartbeats with the pure dumb joy of having done something impossible. Then he shaped the flight toward Castle Black, because that old wall of ice would want to be told before any other fact could be said to be a fact, and because a man always takes his news first to the place that taught him what news is. Behind him the Trident bent and shone and darkened and kept moving. Ahead the night stood up to greet him, and the wind set about the work of reminding him that even a dragon must fly through something. He laughed once and felt his breath tear and mend, and decided he could stand whatever came. The world had diminished around him into something he could carry. He thought there might be more to do than any man could do. He thought there might also be enough time, after all, if one flew over distances that used to kill. The lamps along the wall looked like crumbs left from a loaf the night had eaten, a speck here then another, and between them the long bite of darkness. Frostfire's shadow moved over it like a thought a man didn't quite dare finish. The wind changed when the wall drew near, the way a conversation changes when an old man enters. It cooled and steadied, as if even the air understood what it was passing and felt the necessity of behaving. Ghost lifted his head from the walkway as if called. Jon saw him far below, no more than a pale smudge against black stone, then lost him again. He brought Frostfire in slow, wide circles, not out of ceremony but because landing tired was a way to hurt both beasts. The dragon preferred to judge his own descent anyway. Jon had learned to give over control, which was another way of saying he had learned a new humility. They sat down with a slide and a puff of frost that lifted grain by grain and glittered in the torchlight. Men ran and then remembered not to, and when they remembered too abruptly, their momentum made them stumble and flail, and after they had righted themselves they laughed under their breath at having made themselves human where perhaps they had hoped to be statues. Micken stood with a harness knife tucked into his belt as if the sight of leather made him comfortable. Ed had a bucket he pretended was his whole attention. Bowen Marsh's mouth pressed itself flat as if it were trying to be a line on a ledger. "We'll need a larger door," was the first thing Jeor Mormont said dryly, before Jon's feet had quite remembered the floor. Then, after a space, as if it cost him a small wage to pay the sentence out of his purse. "You came back with no smoke behind you. Good." Jon slid down with that clumsy elegance he had decided to accept. The harness had taught him what his body could do and what it could not. The moment his boots took weight, his legs forgot the sky and remembered their job. He favored one knee without meaning to. Ghost was there, soundless until he wasn't, pushing his muzzle into Jon's thigh as if to gather the new smell and name it. Sam trotted up with a leather satchel against his chest, breath already making smoke, eyes large and shiny. He had the way of a man who would run faster if words could move his legs and had not yet been told otherwise. "Are you all of you?" he blurted before he could arrange a more elegant question. "All your bits." "Enough of them," Jon said. He put a hand on Sam's shoulder, and that hand stayed there the way a weight stays without being a burden. "Win any thrones?" Ed wanted to know, not looking up from the bucket. "I brought extra water in case kingship made you thirsty." "Only a sandbar," Jon said, and the smile that tried his mouth was quickly put in order. He felt a thickness behind his breastbone that no words had permission yet to thin. He let himself breathe until the feeling became manageable. Frostfire's head turned toward the sound of men speaking. The horizontal lid slid halfway and gave Jon the distinct impression of patience being measured. The dragon's chest moved with a slow sound like a smith's bellows at the end of a day when the iron had been persuaded to admit it could be changed. Not triumphant, only content. The heat suffusing the air around him loosened the knots in men's shoulders and made their faces look suddenly young and then quickly old again. Mormont tilted his head as if listening for something outside of the wind. "Inside," he said softly. "Beefo. We make a habit of staring at our own miracle." He glanced at Bowen Marsh and added, "And before we make a habit of arguing about it where ears are." They went into the common hall, where for a wonder the benches had been scrubbed and the floor showed recent work. A stew had been left to think about itself over low heat and smelled of onion and turnip and a generosity of salt. That smell closed over Jon like a hand. For one bewildering moment he wanted to sit down and weep into the steam, the way he had once watched a man do on a day when letters had arrived from the south. He swallowed the impulse because some things were privileges and did not belong to him. He took the wooden spoon and stirred, and the scum that always rides the first hour pulled to one side and made a torn lace at the edge of the pot. The heat rose and his face flushed. "Tell it," Mormont said gently, taking his own spoon and dipping, as if to prove a commander's work lay everywhere a man's did. He set the tasting to the side without lifting the spoon to his mouth. "All of it. Don't make poetry. I am an old man." Jon told it the way he told things to himself when he wanted to be sure the memory would stand, in short lines placed on the table. The river taking the shape of the day. The way men had lifted their faces as the shadow crossed them. The sandbar. The silence. The words he had chosen and how they had felt in his own mouth when they had landed and stuck. He admitted the fear because leaving it out would make everything else ring false. He did not enlarge himself. He did not diminish the others. He let the shape of it be what it had been. "They will call it your dragon," Bowen Marsh said when the telling had made its first circle and settled. "They will call it the Night's Watch's dragon. And there are men here who think they took vows that mean the wall looks only one way." "That isn't what the vows say," Sam said before he could remember himself. "They say we are the shield that guards the realms of men. Plural, realms. Not the realm of kings," Bowen Marsh snapped. Then he colored because he rarely snapped and did not like himself when he did. "Men have long memories for grievances when a beast like that stands near to keep theirs warm." Mormont let them speak, which was the kindness and the skill that kept Jon loving him. "The wall is older than any of these quarrels," he said finally, "and larger. I care a crow's fart for what names they call our boy when they sit and eat and congratulate themselves on their own cleverness. The number of dead this winter will be smaller than it would have been. That buys me anything men can spit at me and still not be worth what has been bought." He turned his great head toward Jon, and the gaze slid over him like a palm over grain. "You will also buy yourself the hatred of fools, and I confess, Snow, I do not know if there are enough hours in the season to bear that price and all the other small ones." "I didn't do it to be loved," Jon said, and wished the sentence did not sound so young. "I did it to keep them from making me choose which of my oaths to break first. And there's a sentence to run rings around," Ed said from the hearth. "If you do it long enough, your feet get caught in the rings and you fall on your face." "Sit," Mormont commanded, and they obeyed the way men do when someone reminds them that their bodies are part of their souls and not separate from them. The bowls came and hands, and the first greedy quiet. Jon could swallow only reluctantly at first, as if his throat could not quite allow simple food to follow after the day's diet of air and smoke. On the third mouthful it gave over the fight and the world grew kinder. After, when the clatter changed to the hum and the men found their joke again underneath the day, Jon escaped to the rookery. Ghost went ahead and took up his place beside the door like a story that is meant to be overheard by anyone who passes. The ravens muttered at Jon, then fell to their work of preening out of sheer habit. They liked hands that came without sudden movements. Maester Aemon slept in his chair, chin against his breast, the blanket a small mountain over his knees. The old man's hands were on his lap, open and honest. When Jon's boots gave their small report on stone, Aemon woke as if he had been only waiting for the cue. "It went how it went," he said, smiling in that way of his that contained no smugness. "That's almost always the answer. Sit and give me the peace that fears itself." Jon told him the part the others had not needed. The feel of the river's weight in the quiet, the knowledge that he had stood at a gate and been allowed to keep standing. He told him, too, about the way the men's faces had changed as the shadow moved. The thing that had moved him nearly to tears, not because it had been fear, which it was, but because it had been common, and in that commonality he had recognized a language, like the first time a boy hears men speak his name with respect. "There is a city inside that moment," Aemon murmured. "You cannot live in it, but if you can visit it at the right hours, it will teach you where to put the walls in the city you are building next." "Did anyone bleed?" "A tent," Jon said, surprised that the detail would please the old man and somehow gratified when it did. "Good," Aemon said simply. Then he was silent for a time, the silence that knits thoughts together. "Dragons ask that men learn to change the size of their thoughts. That is all. It is very hard. You were a hinge today, Jon. Hinges do not decide where the door opens. They only keep men from ripping the whole thing from its frame in the attempt." Jon let the weight of that lie along his shoulders. "He told me a thing," he said, and that was all he needed to say. Aemon became very still, the stillness that says a man has entered a room he has not dared enter in many years and will now not insult whatever is inside by Movi.
"No, they..."
"What did you do with it?" the old man asked. "Set it down on a table in my head," Jon said. "I said I'd come back to it when I had hands to lift it without dropping it and breaking whatever it is." Aemon smiled then like a man who, having been given a glass of water, sees a river. "Wise, you will be asked to pick it up by others. They will want to watch you lift it. They will pretend it is a right. Remember, it is not. Remember, too, that truths are twins. One is the kind you tell so that others may be free. One is the kind you put in your pocket to keep your own hands warm in winter. Don't mix them." "I want to be good," Jon said, and the bare words made him feel briefly ashamed, as if goodness were a small boy asking to stay up late. "Goodness is a neighbor," Aemon said. "You learn to live beside it. It borrows the sugar, you borrow back the flour, you shovel its step when the snow comes first because you woke earlier. Sometimes you quarrel about the fence. But you do not forget the number of the house. Men who think goodness is a kingdom wake up with bloody hands and think washing will cure them." He sighed then, and the sigh was so slight as to almost not be a sound at all. "Bring him to me tomorrow, if the weather has the grace. I would like to feel him near once more before I die." "You won't die," Jon said automatically, then refused himself the lie. "Not soon." Eamon's blind eyes brightened the way a window will when the sun finds the right angle. "Not tonight," he agreed. "The Night's Watch is a machine for living." In the days that followed, the machine did what it was made to do. It swallowed notable events like stones and ground them down into grit and work. Men still rose before dawn punished them. They still broke their waist ice in the jakes with sticks and swore in voices fit for prayer. They put on boots that had never seen warm feet and smiled at one another with the courage of men who enjoy the joke the world insists on. They cut the meat thin to make it seem like more. They wrapped billets of firewood together and argued about axes as if the world were contained in the honor of the blade. They stood watch and forgot themselves enough to become a pair of eyes and a skin that could detect a change in air pressure by a hair's breadth. There were changes. Mikken and his apprentices took over an unused storage room and made of it a leather cave. The smell thickened the air in the corridor, sweet and tarry and animal. And men didn't quite complain because the harness quieted something inside them. Mikken tried half-moons and then skived a strap and then had to begin again because under Frostfire's weight, the stitch that had seemed perfect proved itself a suggestion. He developed a small, exasperated romance with brass. He cursed buckles as if they were noble lords generous with words and poor in deeds. He learned to rub oil into his own hands after the fittings as if to teach them that softness would not mean weakness. Jon learned the rituals of the harness the way he learned prayers as a boy, with repetition and shame. Frostfire allowed hands on his back and belly. He did not permit hands on his neck for 2 days, as if to show that consent looked like something particular even in a beast. On the 3rd day, for no discernible reason, he lowered his head and made a small noise, and that meant yes. The first time Jon tightened the belly strap and heard the leather speak that tiny grunt of strain, he had to walk away and breathe like a man who has just done wrong and knows the wrong was necessary. Feeding him was the honest work that made men friends. Frostfire hunted when he liked. High, brief loops taken on the bitter days. A shadow across the snow, a rush, a scream, the black dot of a deer or a sheep being unstitched from the world, and then he slept like a god or a cat. He didn't hunt large often because he hadn't needed to learn how yet. Jon did not let him learn on the herds that kept Black Brothers standing through the worst months. He would owe those men too much if he allowed the beast to make their thrift into bones. So they organized drives when the light was kind, stretching rope between poles to suggest a path to stupid creatures, whistling low, moving in a loose scoop that gathered breath. Dolorous Ed complained that the work would be more cheerful if they painted the poles blue and gave them names, then asked whoever was listening if naming a thing ever kept it from biting. On the 4th morning, Jon rose with a little fever in his skin that the cold could not put out. He took Frostfire north with only 2 others below, small dots tugging a sled in case something broke that couldn't be mended with a word. The sky had that clean look that comes after snow and before more. The dragon took the air with impatience. Jon grinned like a fool and let him. From the sky, the world looked as if some great beast had breathed on the glass of the day and then dragged a claw across it. Swirls and strokes and the hilts of trees. Jon saw the old ranger paths as if men's footfalls had stained them with a paint only air could reveal. He saw, too, places where the snow had been disturbed by nothing he had a word for. Could have been wind. Could have. They found the fishing camp by smell first. Dead fish and old nets and people. The people were wrong. They stood like afterthoughts a child had scraped into a cake, leaning into each other and into the wind in a way no living thing leans. Frostfire slowed because Jon did without being told, the 2 of them making a sluggish circle that sent shadows that did not mean anything to people who had stopped reading shadows. The men below looked up when Jon waved them off. He thought they nodded. He brought the dragon down in a slow glide along the shore where the river was a black ribbon the ice had not found the courage to cross. The bodies were 30 or 35. Jon was ashamed that after the first 10 he stopped being a blee to count without feeling it like a sin. They were arranged the way the living arrange the dead when they have time. Blankets, a poor order, the dignity poverty can afford. The blankets had been disturbed. That was what he saw first. That and the way one head, the hair pale, wet like grass, did not keep to the shape that heads prefer when the neck allows. The mouth moved and shut and moved again. "Fire," Jon said, hoarse. He did not know to whom he was speaking. Frostfire's breath looked like a smelter's dream. The small gout never touched flesh. Jon hadn't asked for that. The dragon had decided. The flame ran along the tattered reeds and woke the camp into color. The men below had axes in hand but not raised. They did not move. Their stillness made the camp look like a picture. The first dead thing stood. Jon did not draw his sword. He did not have the faith in steel that he'd once had. The creature moved badly. It had forgotten the conversation bone has with flesh. Frostfire did a new thing. He bent his head and sent a line of fire along the ground like a finger drawing a circle. The first of the dead stepped into it and flared like a wick. No sound came from it. The lack of sound was worse than a scream. Another fell and another. The two living men below started back as if from a cliff. One crossed himself as if to any god that learned too late it had worshippers this far north. Jon counted breaths and heat. He told himself, "Here is a thing I know how to win." Behind that thought something older and colder sneered. What if this is not the thing that will kill you? What if the thing that kills you carries no warmth to announce itself? He held the line of fire with his hand as much as with Frostfire's will. He imagined for an insane instant Eamon's thin palm making that same gesture. When the last was a char of a thing and then not even that, the air smelled like a burnt hair and a smith's apron. The water moved as if relieved. Jon swung down and put his hand on the nearest not body, then scolded himself for the waste of reverence. "Who did this?" he asked the men, even though he knew they could not tell him anything beyond the width of their fear. "The cold came in a circle," one said, and his lips were cracked and blood made bright punctuation on what he was trying to say. "It stood up like a man." "How many?" Jon asked, and his voice felt wrong in his throat. "How many years has it been since the last time we counted?" The man replied crazily, and then he began to laugh softly, as if laughter would be accepted as a form of pay at the end of this conversation. Jon stood a moment letting the cold tell him truths he had not wanted to hear this way. He understood then a plain fact. Dragons are a way to change the conversation with the dead. They do not erase the grammar. He set his jaw and was careful with his face when he looked up so that the men below would be able to keep their own faces. "We bring 2 back," he said. "Burn the rest. Mark this place on the map with 2 lines. 2 lines means do not come without fire or without too many reasons." They dragged 2 bodies that had been bodies and now were only big stones under cloth. Frostfire sniffed them and made a disgusted little cough as if to say he understood what Jon was doing and reserved the right to disagree. Jon put his hand briefly to the dragon's cheek and felt the lids ripple under his palm. "I know," he said. They flew back into a wind that had gotten itself organized while Jon was learning. When they touched stone again, he could not feel his hips. He made himself move them anyway. Humiliation is a very cold thing to be warmed by. The first of the bodies went to the same long table where men mended their straps and counted the voices in town when storms meant the gate had to be opened and shut twice as often. Jeor Mormont stood with his hands at his back and the weight of his attention leaned sideways, toward Eamon. "Burn them now," Bowen Marsh said, and his voice shook with eagerness, lumped with fear. "Don't bring them inside. By the Father, Lord Commander, we tried to tell you about the last ones." "That's why they're on tables," Ed observed gravely, "and not in our laps. Having a lap is the kind of luxury we've learned to maintain." "Sam," Jon said, and Sam came forward as if he'd been pulled, his eyes already full of information. He set his satchel down and took from it a knife with a handle that had been wrapped twice over in blue cloth against frostbite. He set the knife on the table, swallowed, and with his other hand reached for the cloth that lay over one of the heads. Eamon's voice stopped him. "Wait, let me listen." The old man came forward without a man to arm him with his dignity. He carried it himself. He put both hands on the edge of the table in a way that made Jon think of boys mixing mud to make their first bricks. He lowered his head until his hair just kissed the linen. The room silenced itself the way rooms do when someone very close to truth is speaking and might let a word fall. Eamon made the smallest sound Jon had ever heard him make, a sound that might have been nothing but a breath lifted through a tighter place in the chest. "They are," Eamon began, and could not find a word he liked well enough. "They want." That was the right word. Jon knew it the moment the old man said it. A need came out of the thing on the table like heat from a cooled hearth. Want without direction is a sickness. Jon felt a sudden complicated pity. He did not want and put his hand firmly on the knife because pity is how you die the wrong deaths. "Now," Mormont said. "Burn them now." His voice had no tremble. He had allowed Eamon his listening. He would not allow the dead theirs. They burned at the edge of the yard under a sky that had got tired of being blue and had gone back to gray. Men stood and shuffled and watched fire do what it always did. Erase and call it cleansing. Frostfire watched from his place by the stables, head high, eyes half-lidded. Ghost lay away off, his head on his paws, in that not sleep that wolves do when they are waiting for others to remember they are animals too. When the smoke had gone high and the smell had turned from hair to something sourer and then to nothing, Jon felt a ridiculous urge to apologize to the air. The word went to the south faster than even ravens. Men's hunger for novelty is a wind of its own. Before 7 days had turned their circle, a messenger stamped into the yard with the smell of humid southlands still on him and the delighted offense of a man who had not expected winter to bite this particular inch of his calf. He had the colors of a stag at his breast and a cold in his head that made his words lumpy. He sought out Jeor Mormont with the bravery of a man who has been told his errand cannot be delayed by trivialities like lungs. Jon did not listen to all of it. He let tone and gesture convey the parts of the message there was nothing to be done about. The South was reorganizing its hates. Tywin Lannister's name came like an iron pot being set down. Hard. Stannis's like a starved cat that might eventually become a tiger if allowed to keep stalking the same paths. The Trident parchment was being called by the wrong names in 3 different cities. The word traitor had been opened like a box and men were taking from it anything they could use to carry their loss. "He asks for the dragon to come to King's Landing," Mormont said after he had broken the seal and paused to watch the light move through the red wax. It was a curiosity in his voice rather than surprise. "He asks as if asking were an old habit he cannot set down." "He?" Bowen Marsh demanded at once, confidence born of exhaustion sharpening where it would not otherwise. "The boy? The queen? The Lannister? In whose name?" "In the name of the realm," Mormont said, and the faintest shadow of a smile touched his mouth as if he had been told an elaborate joke and found only the little humor in it. "In the name of order, in the name of common sense, in the name of debts already paid and debts men think are owed. The boy has his tutors." "I won't go," Jon said, and the waveform of relief in his chest might have carried one of the ravens to a warmer tower. He looked at Mormont for the flinch, for the lecture, for the patient smothering. He received none. He received only a nod that made him love the old man once more in a new way, because it was a nod that said, "Good, your mind is learning the angles of this burden's weight." "We send words," Mormont replied. "We send bread. We send the proof of what we've burned. We send little bits of justice where we can spare them. We do not send fire to be petted by men who habitually forget what they are doing when their hands are warm." "Your brother will ask as well," Eamon said when they had gathered that night to talk and to pretend their thoughts were food. "He will ask in a different voice. He will not ask less." Jon put his face in his hands and pressed his eyes until stars came. They swam like minnows against a dark river. "If I go," he said, "I break the wall's oath. If I do not, I betray a different oath that nobody asked me to say out loud or in a room, but which I took in a boy's heart and a man's head without the courtesy of having it witnessed." "People make kings that way," Eamon said. "They take oaths we do not hear. The difference between kingship and damnation is whether the oaths are to men or to yourself. Don't take too many. Be careful who your witnesses are. Some men have eyes that will eat your promises as if they were bread." "You think me a king?" Jon asked, and the word where it lay in his mouth was an unripe fruit. He wanted to spit. I think you a boy who has done a thing that men will insist on using to tell other stories, Eamon said. They will fit you into them even if you do not fit. That is how stories are. You must learn how to be the wrong size in the right way. At Eastwatch by the sea, a man with a face like a gull and a tongue that didn't have the time other men give to vowels waited for ships with an old habit of impatience. He sent a message up the wall, rough as fish skin in the mouth. Sails by the dozen, black and a red flame that was not a painted one. The message arrived attached to a man who had already had to speak too loudly over a wind that liked to perform. Mormont raised an eyebrow at the sigil and then at the title. Lord Stannis Baratheon, by right of war and birth king of Westeros, sent greetings and a priest, and requested hospitality until a conversation could be fitted into the weather. Send them to sit on the shore and freeze all the parts they think sacred. Bowen Marsh muttered, but he made the rude noise of a man who still knows the difference between what he wants and what must be. She wanted the cold, Ed said inexplicably. Said something about the breath of true things. Jon felt a small muscle in his neck quiver with anticipation and something very near dread. He knew then that the red woman the ships carried would smell like cinnamon and old coal, and that she would look at Frostfire as if measuring a dress. He did not know how he knew. He felt the knowledge turn in him like a coin rubbing against the inside of a skin purse. She came like the weather she had asked for. Bravely, foolishly, wrapped in red so improbable against the snow that the color looked like an idea rather than a dye. Her hair was the precise red of old blood on new snow. She smiled when she saw the dragon, and the smile was not a woman's, precisely. It was the smile of someone to whom triumph and confirmation meant the same thing. Her eyes found Jon, saw him, dismissed him, found him again the way a falcon finds a question and then decides to answer it after all. Azor Ahai, she said, tasting the syllables, making of them a kind of pastry in her mouth. At last the night brings me news. Worth the lantern. I have come a long way to light the right fire. Jon did not flinch before titles. He had learned at the Trident that some names agreed with you only if you let them. You've come to cold, he said mildly. If it's news you want, we are not skint of that. News burns out, she replied, unbothered. Names don't. Most names do, Eamon murmured, behind Jon's shoulder, and the woman's head turned like a cat's. She looked past Jon, and her smile altered into something like respect despite herself. You, I know, she said, or I know the idea of you. You carry your heat in a place that confounds me. You carry your cold where it cannot be warmed, Eamon returned, and if there was one edge of dry humor at the corners of his blind eyes, no one else dared notice it. Behind the woman, a man came up the slope with the dogged piety of a man in shoes twice too heavy. He smelled faintly of fish and salt, and he carried his plainness like a banner. Davos, he said, as if vexed at the need to announce himself. Seaworth, I've been sent to say what can't be said by a priest. Few can, Mormont observed. He made them welcome in the way men make whether welcome, because pretending otherwise only humiliates everyone. The Glover boys widened their eyes privately and then bent to their tasks harder, as if work were a charm against being burned by red witchery. Frostfire watched from a distance, the way cats refuse to convene with other creatures until the creatures prove their disinterest. Ghost watched the woman with the bland, altered patience he reserved for anything that smelled of other rooms and other rules. The first conversation was delicately bloody. Men set knives on the table and then moved them half an inch away to show everyone they could be trusted not to use them. The red woman smiled at the old timbers overhead as if she could set them alight by flattery alone. Davos listened to the wind until it had finished speaking and then spoke himself in sentences that made no attempt at beauty. The North is interesting when you say it to yourself, he began. When you put it in your mouth in a room like this, it stops being an idea and becomes a plank. You can lie on it and look at the sky and think yourself safe, and then along comes the sea and lifts you, and it isn't your plank anymore. Stannis has asked, that you accompany him south with your beast to make a king who wasn't made in a bed. He says there is a war coming the size of the world. He says kings are not the point. He says kings are the way to make men's feet point the right way. He paused. Davos had the useful humility of a man who had never thought his words candles. That's a lot of saying. Mance would be interested to hear that Stannis has discovered wars larger than kingship, Mormont said easily, and the red woman's mouth flickered, as if she were choking down impatience with the skill of a lifetime. Tell him he has our bread and what warmth we can spare. Tell him it is not our custom to make of ourselves a retinue. Tell him also that if he wishes to see how fire works on the dead, he may remain long enough to watch. He looked at Jon then, the look that says, I am a leader who uses the men he has in the best way he can, even when the best way is to let them speak when it would be more comfortable for me to speak. Jon did not stand. He did not feel he had to. If the priestess demanded it, she would have begun with fire. You have come hundreds of miles to tell me something my bones know, he said. Winter is the war that makes a mockery of wars. The rest of your sentence is the part we have not learned how to agree on. I am not a torch to be taken from bracket to bracket by men with maps. She looked at him as if he had said a clever thing that failed to be a wise thing. You think yourself different from the men with maps? She tilted her head until the red fall of hair swung and brushed the cloth over her breast, which had been cut to advertise a god's confidence in his own merchandise. You think you are not your own map? This is very sweet. You have a kind face for a boy raised by wolves. Raised by decent people in winter. Jon corrected her gently, and that put a small appreciative noise from Davos into the air. This one is not stupid, the Onion Knight said, as if to himself and the wind. I keep throwing cleverness at people and waiting for cleverness to break, and it never does. Stannis will not like that about you. Stannis can make a line at the back of my mind with all the other disapprovals, Jon said, and the red woman laughed then. A sound men would afterwards suspect had been rehearsed by many women for many uses. This one is not stupid, she repeated lightly. So say you with your smuggler's honesty. I was born honest, Davos said. And then, as if that sentence had embarrassed him by being too big, he added, It took money and near drowning to teach me how to do it without making a scene. They remained for 2 days and a quarter the way weather remains when it is trying to discover if this is the place it has been trying to reach all along. Davos watched men with the kind of interest that makes friends. The red woman watched Frostfire with the kind of calculation that makes ash. She sought Jon twice and was polite in a way that made him wish impoliteness were a currency he could spend. She spoke of a sword in a heart and a woman in a bed and a night whose grammar had lost its verbs. She did not quite say his name in a way that made it smaller. She said it in a way that made the room's air feel otherwise. He answered with the patience you are taught around dangerous nobles and lunatics and men with too much skill with knives. When she tired of his refusal to be improved, she turned slickly to Aemon, as if age and wisdom could be flatteringly harvested. Do you think he belongs to the fire? She asked the old man in a tone that suggested she would accept a thoughtfully argued no while preparing for a yes. I think he belongs to the cold, Aemon answered simply, and the red woman did not like that at all. You could see it in the frustrated school of her mouth. The cold that has decided there must be warmth or we will die. It's a different thing than you think it is. Fire that belongs to itself is useless. When the ships went away, they left behind a smell of tar and a rumor of a draft down the corridor that didn't exist. Men stood easier in their harness after that. For 3 days and a half, the sky tried to discover what clouds are for and then, having reacquainted itself, made a proper storm. The wall found its old voice and bellowed twice, the report traveling like a thought through stone. In those days Jon slept and then woke and lay for an hour with his palms against his eyes, teaching himself to breathe without counting the beats in Frostfire's flight. Letters came and were boiled and made thin by the work of transport, as all letters are. Robb's had a good horse in it. Energy, a willingness to carry, and grief that had tamped itself cleverly in the corners. He thanked Jon and did not thank him. He forgave him and did not say for what. He explained and then let the explanations wither properly on the stem because the thing had already been done. He asked, once, in a sentence so simply made that Jon could hear the boy in it like a bell heard down a long corridor, if Jon could come for a day to see their mother and make of their lives a different shape than the one they had started to fear might be permanent. Jon wrote answers twice and burned both, and then wrote a third that spoke of things that could be said in rooms without looking like wishes. He enclosed a lock of horsehair braided awkwardly, a memory of the paddock, a joke from a day before winter had taught everyone to be serious, and said no to what his body had wanted to say yes to. He sealed the letter neatly, saw the wax cool, and longed briefly to be a man who did not know what he was doing to himself. Tywin Lannister sent no letters. He sent a man who had a watchmaker's hands and a butcher's eyes. The man delivered a set of compliments so mechanically flawless that you could see where they had been sanded. He asked after Frostfire's health and Mormont's and Jon's with equal regard, and reminded the room that King's Landing cisterns would suffer if winter came early to the Crownlands, and that the Crown did not forget friends or enemies or possibly useful assets. "What does he want?" Ed asked afterwards, when the watchmaker's man had taken himself away with the precise posture of someone avoiding a puddle. "To be remembered as having done his duty when we decide who forgot theirs," Mormont said, "and to be on the list of those who dared stand near a dragon without sweating. Men keep those lists and proffer them at inconvenient moments in spring." Catelyn Stark's letter was 3 letters in one. A mother's, full of meticulous weather, a lady's exact about grain, and a woman's who had once been a girl, an almost poem about rivers that remembered their own father. There was a sentence in it Jon had to put his hand over to keep his eyes from reading again and again. "I do not know what to do with the fact that my children keep becoming men in front of the wrong witnesses." He carried that sentence around in his pocket and let his hand touch it sometimes the way men touch talismans in a battle. He began to take Frostfire north as a matter of course. Men along the walkways learned to close their mouths before he lifted, because the breath went out, and when it came back it came in too greedily at the sight. He went to the places on the map the old rangers had marked in small, steady script and put his shadow on them. Sometimes the shadow showed him what he had come for. A ring of cold, prints that did not leave water where water should have melted. Twice he saw a figure he had no word for, a light that was not a light and a stillness so complete it moved. The first time he breathed through it and sent fire to remind the air what things were supposed to do. The second time he placed the dragon's shadow in a different place and watched the figure look at it, then go away without being convinced. He came back with ice in his mustaches and patience in his heart, and placed the new information on the long table as if it were a piece of bread. Mance Rayder sent a song and 3 spears with their heads turned wrong way. The song said that the wall had always been a story and that stories do change at the telling. Jon did not know what to do with the spears, and so leaned them against a wall in a neat row where men could pass them by and be made to feel formally confused. He took Sam once on Frostfire's back because the boy asked, and because he needed to be reminded that nothing he had found belonged to him alone. They strapped the poor, round scholar into a leather that met him kindly, and when Frostfire lifted, the sound Sam made was like the sound wine makes in a skin when you run up a hill with it. He laughed then, a full, round thing that embarrassed him and let him be happy despite it, and after he had stopped laughing he set his hand cautiously on a scale. "It's like a book," he said with wonder. "The skin of it. The way there are 1,000 little different pieces that make a whole you can trust if you read it right." "You're not supposed to read scales," Jon said, smiling, and then realized he had used a voice his father had used, and went quiet for 2 full breaths while the wind accepted the unspent words and took them off his hands. He took Eamon below one dawn when the cold could not be called more cruel than usual. They put blankets around the old man and set him in a chair as if he were a child going to watch a parade, which he accepted with the pride of a man who knows the difference between dignity and vanity. Frostfire came near and lowered his head, and the thin LD hand rose like a bird and lay itself along the jawline and lingered along the pre-orbital ridge. Jon saw the dragon's eye half close, and if a beast like that could be said to smile with an eye, it did. "Hello?" Eamon whispered, and that was all. Something passed between them that had no weight but a mass, and Jon looked away out of respect for men and gods. "Tell him not to die," Jon said afterward without hope for an answer because hope would be greedy there. "Tell him to wait until men who die tell themselves things," Eamon said, cheerful and wicked in a way that made him look briefly like a boy. "Dragons decide what they will listen to. I will not make him my nurse. I can only ask that he allow me to arrive at the leaving with grace." Alistair Thorne had an opinion, naturally, and he held it as if a cold could be cured by fervor. His absence during the early weeks had been a grace being allowed to fail, and when he returned, eyes irritated by wind and mouth holding in a waiting of bitterness, he thought manly. He made it his business to take hold of the idea of the dragon and shake it like a terrier shakes a boot. He had no power men would willingly admit, so he made noises in corners, and they carried, as corner noises do. "One boy and a beast," he said too loudly in the yard. The second hour after the third bell, when men's tempers run a little longer than their patience. "We swore to Wall and Winter, not to follow boys with names we barely dare guess at." He didn't look at John when he said it, which would have been bold, and Thorne liked the appearance of boldness too much to spend any of the real thing on this. He looked at the men and counted which faces responded. Gior Mormont put an end to it the way men put down sick dogs. Quietly, publicly, with a hand on the back of the neck. He called the hall and spoke and did not raise his voice. "A dragon is a tool," he said, "like a sword, like a shovel, like a boy. We have always been a place that uses tools. You may discuss the tool's virtue in the snow until your hands freeze, if that's what you want. Or you can use the tool. This is not a temple. If you want a temple, build one, and I will come in with my hat in my hands and see if I like what you have made enough to kneel in it." The laughter was clean, and Thorne had to laugh too or be seen to be the only man who did not understand a joke, and that is the smallest of exiles. He swallowed the rest that day. He would cough it up later, perhaps in small, sharp bits. John noted the faces Thorne counted and remembered the count. The wall held. The dead tested. The South sent letters and lies in delightful equal measure. The dragon grew. He learned to land on the topmost walkway with the delicacy of the figure a scribe makes when he gives up the last flourish on a capital letter. His feet nestled on stone where men's boots had smoothed the frost to glass, claws clicking as he placed weight like a book set on a shelf. They sunk bolts into the ice for him to grip, and the noise the irons made going in was like the laugh of a drunk man eavesdropping a holy conversation. Micken fitted leather that made fewer noises when it moved, and the dragon accepted it with the weary tolerance of a husband allowing a wife to pin another item of ribbon to his sleeve. On a day newly minted by the cold, John took him further north than he had dared and came down into an old ruin where the stones had been stacked by someone who had trusted men to return and keep stacking them higher, and the men had not, and Winter had been the last stonemason. He walked between the fragments with Ghost ranging and Frostfire's head over his shoulder like a father's. The cold was an argument there, not just a temperature. It tried to insist on a conclusion John would not sign. He turned the corner of what had been a hall and found a carving. A woman with a knife, worn thin by wind and the lack of hands to worship her. He said aloud before he knew he had spoken, "I will not be the only story told about this winter." And the snow took it and kept it. The second time he saw one of the cold figures, it was closer. It did not hurry. It did not need to. It had a patience that made John feel briefly childish. Frostfire drew breath like a bellows. John held up his hand, because he wanted to see the thing's face. It had a face in the way an idea has a face, suggested by the light on the ice. He felt a small madness rise in him, the urge to ask it its name. He spoke the dragon's name instead, quietly, Frostfire, and the beast answered with a jet of fire so precise John could have used it to cut leather. The figure didn't burn. The ground around it did. It stood and then it left. Not in a hurry, not panicked. Displeased. John felt an absurd pride take him. To displease such a thing was near to a triumph. That night he dreamed of the Trident again. It ran in 3 branches and each was a language. In one men spoke coin, in one men spoke banners, and in the last men spoke the names of the dead they would not release. He stood in the green of willows and watched them speak and thought how little his fire had changed the grammar. He woke in the cold dawn with his throat dry and in his mouth a taste like smoke and honey both. A raven watched him from the rafters and made a noise that could have been dragon and could have been hunger. He began to practice a new discipline after that, holding his tongue. He would go down to the dragon's place and sit with his back against the warm flank and say nothing, not even Frostfire, not even yes. He discovered that men make too many words and that dragons do not mind. They like heat and the weight against them that says, "Here is another thing alive beside you that can be trusted to be alive for this next breath at least." He took that lesson from the dragon and brought it up to the hall and sat sometimes mongst his brothers and set his weight along the bench and said little. The quiet moved Thr. Oof the men like a useful animal. Thorn found himself saying fewer spiteful things when he had expected to be able to say more. Bowen Marsh counted his beans and forgot to add a pinch of warning to the count. Ed complained in a lower voice, and the complaint sounded more like the world and less like a curse. On an afternoon hoary as an old man's eyebrow, a small woman in sealskins appeared from the north with the air of someone who had seen a great joke and was unsure if anyone else here had heard it told right. She carried a spear that had had 3 lives and now was proud of being a 4th. She saw the dragon, nodded once to concede that she had not been misled, and then found Jon and told him she was expected. "My king would speak with you, if your people call him king. If not, call him what you like. He doesn't much care." "Mance?" Jon said, pleased to have the name at last in his mouth like a pebble he had been rolling in his hand for weeks. She nodded, as if granting him rights to a song. "He says bring the fire where the ice is hardest. He says leave behind any man who talks loud and eats his own words. He says if you bring more than 2 men, you will come home with fewer than you left." Jeor Mormont blew out as if a memory had surprised him and then gathered itself and gone behind a tree. "He thinks himself in a song," he observed, not unkindly. "Show him we've kept an ear for rhythm anyway." Jon went with her because he had to. Because if he did not, Mance would make up another Jon in his head and negotiate with the wrong boy. He took Sam's worry like a small, warm stone in a pocket and left it there where he could touch it, and took Ghost and the dragon because that was now the sentence written under his tongue. Because going alone would only indulge Mance. Because going with too many men would announce wrong things in the snow. Frostfire disliked the seal woman and then liked her. He had a way of liking men and women who refused to be improved by his size. Ghost liked her immediately, which was a coin to be counted. Mance had set his camp in a place that asked men to blush for the effort it took to reach it. A low basin cut by wind and time and a stubborn water that went on doing its duty. The tents were arranged like a conversation. The fires were cautious. Children watched the dragon with the wide solemnity of a first prayer. The man himself was plainer than Jon had expected, which was refreshing. Kings with notions of themselves had become tedious. He stood with his hands half open at his sides, as if holding nothing were a habit he wanted to show off. "Jon Snow," he said, with no music in it but the necessary notes, and then had the grace to look at Ghost first and the dragon second and the boy last. "You make a noise." "So do you," Jon returned, liking him despite the part of him that had promised himself not to, because liking is how men get killed by the very things they needed to learn. "And you've gathered yourself into a shape other men have named enemy. I came to see if the shape was the right one." Mance smiled with his mouth, not his eyes. "The shape is the one I can afford. I haven't your luxury. Your luxury is a small god." He tilted his head toward Frostfire. "I prefer plain gods. Fire. Food. Thaw." "You want to bring the whole of your people south," Jon said, and let himself be tired for a sentence. "If I say yes as simply as that sentence is said, I betray every man I keep on a wall built for exactness." Mance's eyes changed then. The small mischief receded and the bigger seriousness revealed itself like a blunt tool. "And if you say no as simply as that sentence is said, you betray every man your wall was meant to keep alive. Do we measure different sums?" "Yes," Jon said, liking him more for having come straight at the arithmetic. "And no." They took an hour and then another and then a third, and the dragon slept through them and the wolf slept through half. They chewed cold meat because men chewing have better tempers. They let the cold got into their lips and then decided to ignore it. Mance told him what the ice had done 2 days beyond the last place the maps admitted to. Jon told him what he had burned and seen, the lack of screaming that had been the worst part of it. They found they liked telling the truth with small words. A woman came and sat near and did not speak, and Jon saw, with a small start he kept to himself, the strength of her face and the way people glanced at her as one checks to see if one is still moving in the right direction. Mance did not introduce her. Her name entered the conversation later because names do. Not because anyone said it there. Dalla. At last Mance put out his hands and made a gesture that was an apology for having no table. Let us make a map on air. We fancy our way through. You open a door. I keep men from breaking it. We go through slowly, convincing those who must be convinced, frightening those who must be frightened, bringing winter sense to men whose sense has been made in rooms. Your old man with bare shoulders, he will hate it and also make it possible. He will hate it, Jon agreed, and found himself smiling with a bitterness that did not collapse him. He will then do it right. We do as we must, Mance said and blew out, warming his hands over that poor fire as if mocking all the smaller fires he had ever warmed his hands at. And then your red priestess arrives behind you with skulls on a string to make of the doing a holy thing and to break it like a boy's kite in the wind. You know her, Jon said, surprised into liking Mance still more. Mance's smile moved a millimeter. I know the kind. I sang songs for kings. I know the look a zealot makes while pretending to be patient. Your dragon is her bell. She will ring it until she deafens us all. I can be very rude, Jon offered lightly. Ask anyone. You will have to be, Mance said with no humor in it. You will have to teach the South the difference between being frightened useful and being frightened stupid. If you waste all your fire on teaching that lesson, you will have nothing left for the thing that requires it. They parted as men part when the tent walls are thin, with a handshake that was a promise reached through the cold like a plank. Jon took Frostfire up under a sky that had decided against letting the sun be seen that day, and as they rose the children, those that were old enough to decide for themselves when to be cautious, ran, made the small sounds children make when joy and fear haven't been separated yet. He looked down and saw Dalla watching not him but Mance, measuring, and had the uneasy thought that if this woman decided snow should be told to stop falling, the snow might consider it. When he told Mormont, the old man did not speak for a good while. He made a sound in his throat as if he were chewing something with an uncooperative texture. We will do it in pieces, he said finally, as if to himself, and then louder with that rough, sudden authority he could still summon. We will lean on White Harbor. We will tell men that being alive is a tax. We will spend grain like coin and hate ourselves for it. We will make of the gift a kind of slope and teach the wild ones to come down it without breaking their own necks. We will set men with clever words at Moat Cailin, men who can say no in a dozen ways that look like yes. And we will tell the South that this is happening, and anyone who knows the words to the old prayers is welcome to teach them to newcomers. Bowen Marsh turned purple and then a thoughtful kind of pale. They will steal, he muttered. So do we, Mormont returned. Every time we bury a man who would have fed a family, we steal him from them. This way we save some bread to feel bad about. They began with the small things. They always do. A sled turned into a sledge. The runners shod with a scavenged iron that Micken worried was ill-used until the first load slid down the rough road like a swear word and made everyone laugh. A stove moved from one abandoned croft into another less abandoned and fed with peat that men cussed at because peat dirties everything and then blessed because dirt has a way of making heat seem earned. A boy from the wilds shivered in the yard nearer the kitchens than the gate and was told sternly by Ed to go in or freeze and chose to go in and then stopped in the doorway amazed by the smell of onions. And that smell convinced him more than any speech. Jon took the first families down with Frostfire circling overhead. He did not threaten. He did not need to. He let the shadow do the announcing while he became boring on purpose, explaining where the latrines were and why. He watched a woman from the wilds whose hair had made up its mind never to be tamed look at a pot with a sturdy lid as if it were a gift from a god who knew how women lived. He watched a man fail to understand why you stacked wood here and not there and then understand and look ashamed at having been taught a thing by a boy who had no beard. He carried that shame home like a debt he would pay to someone else. Tycho Nestoris from the Iron Bank came while all this ordinariness was being arranged. He arrived looking like the balance sheet of a rich house and made a nice presentation of not noticing that there was a dragon. He noticed without noticing where the bolts had been sunk into the ice and where the stores had been moved against flooding, and where the grain lay that had been counted twice. He was an intelligent man and therefore frightened of different things than most. "You convince me this will eventually pay," he said in the hall after he had drunk something that had tried to sit up in his cup. "Not in coin. Coin is a lazy measurement. In stability. Stability is the only interest a bank accepts that can't be altered by a king's head falling off. We have nothing to offer you but the absence of dead merchants," Mormont said. "That's enough." "It often is," Tycho Nestoris said, and smiled in the way of a man who can smile only once in a month and has decided to spend it now. The winter went on being the winter. It refused to be improved by politics. The nights lengthened by the petty measures men use to convince themselves they are not being cheated. Another log, another blanket, another lie told better by Ed than by anyone else. John flew and learned. He was thrown once, only once, and the humiliation was as nourishing as bread. He broke nothing. Frostfire broke his own pride the way beasts do when they realize a rock is not an enemy. They stood, filthy and angry and alive, and each looked at the other and decided not to carry the slight into the next day. And then an arrow came from nowhere, because men who do not believe in dragons believe in arrows. It did not find flesh, found leather and stuck there and made a noise like a rude word. They followed the arrow's shaft back through the air as if it were a ribbon someone had dropped, and found an old tower that had learned to be coy with the wind. Inside the tower, a man lay with the complacency of one who has been taught by no god to fear the price of ridiculous bravery. He was gray and thin and wore his mouth like a knife. John did not kill him. He sent him out into the snow with a gag and a rope and a note tied to his neck like a child's lunch. Bring this man's house into the gift and make him carry the wood for 8 families and learn how to be warm. And he understood then why men with dragons are despised. Because they find it easy to make mercy a spectacle and act as if that makes it more useful than it is. Jeor Mormont went to the rookery more and more, as if words had become bread for him. He said little there as well. He sat with Eamon and they shared an old kindness between them. The pleasure of being men who did not have to be explained to one another. One afternoon John stopped in the doorway and fell. For an instant a weight in the room that was not the old men. It was something brought in with them and set down between them, a task. Jeor looked up and caught the boy's eye, and for a heartbeat John saw grief lift the old man like a wave. "What shall I do with you?" Jeor said softly later, out in the yard with the dragon heat making a clean lane of air between them and the rest of the cold. "If I were the sort of man who made kings, I would run in circles now and knock down every pot and set everything alight on accident and then pretend I meant to. I am not that sort of man. I will teach you to be a better version of the sort of man I am." "What sort is that?" John asked, and the wind took the boy from his voice, which was a mercy. The question sounded tired, as if meant for someone else. "The sort who moves a small stone on a big map the right inch," Jeor said simply, "and who does not forget why he is moving it. No other sort lives long enough to do anything worth setting in a song." He lit the terms of the Trident like a lamp then, explaining with the patience of a farmer listing debts and seeds. The prisoner exchanges had bled off some hatred. Tywin had conceded not a point but a posture. Stannis had made noises that could be carved into justice if you were clever with a chisel. Robb had gathered the ragged cloth of what the war had left and made of it a coat that would keep no one as warm as a blanket would have, but would at least signify decency. The worst men had left the table because there had been no chairs made to look like thrones for them. The best had remained, ashamed. The rest waited for someone to tell them how to talk about the day without lying to themselves in a way that would later need to be paid for. John listened and said nothing until the map stones had been set in their increments. They will need a winter to make words. They will come back to their words in spring and try to mend them. People cannot believe too many impossible things in one season. That is the kindest possible version of what will happen, Mormont agreed. We'll prepare for the other kinds. He slept badly when he slept. When he woke, he went to the stables out of habit, his hand knowing exactly where on the post it liked to rest. He found a bundle there that had been left on purpose, a squared parcel wrapped in a piece of old sailcloth, with a string done twice and then once again as if knots were a form of prayer. John touched the string and knew the hands. He remembered the feel of them like old bark. He cut the string and found a thing inside he had never seen and couldn't help recognizing. It was a sheaf of torn pages written in two hands. One precise and somewhat bitter, the other finer and whimsical and impatient with margins. Under them, a piece of cloth the color of dusk had been folded too many times for too many years. He opened it and the breath left him and came back and left again because his body could not decide if it would allow him to breathe this. A favor. A foolish, small, lovely thing a woman had tied to a man's arm 400 lifetimes ago. The cloth smelled like wool and something like lemon that might have been no more than the memory of lemon in the fingers that had once tied it. There was no letter. He did not need one. He went to Eamon with the pages and found the old man ready, as if he had sensed the weight in the bundle as the raven had carried it. Together, the way two carpenters will examine a beam, they read a name where it had been made to look like another. They found a marriage where men had sworn there had been none because the war liked the story better that way. They found in the edges a constancy no song had bothered to say because constancy is not good for chorus. Eamon's hands trembled once. John didn't let himself look at that tremble long enough to make it a poem. "Do you know what to do?" Eamon asked finally, simple. "No," John said truthfully. "Not yet. Mance was right. If I pick it up and wave it about, I become a flag. I would rather be a barn. Men need barns." "You may have to be both," Eamon said without pity. "Consider it a practice in metaphor." He tied the favor around his wrist anyway, low, where no man with a taste for tidiness would approve. He wore it under a glove. He felt it scratch as a blessing he did not want and needed. Ghost liked to put his nose there, as if to name it, to approve its stripe of otherness. In the last week before midwinter, a cold came that was so pure the air did not seem fit for lungs. Men swore because swearing was warmer than breath. The ice near the top of the wall made a noise like a complaint issued formally to a magistrate. Snow learned to fall more slowly and made the effort look elegant. The Red Woman did not return. Davos sent a note with a fishbone in it like a joke he had been forced to make at the last moment. Then the ravens began to drop from the sky. 2, then 1, then 3. Not many. Enough to become a pattern. The birds fell as if someone had opened their chests and scooped out the thing that tells a bird how to be alive. Ghost brought one to John, careful not to bite. The raven had an insulted look. Its eyes were dull. John put his ear near its beak, foolishly. Then he shook himself and had the sense to carry it to Eamon. The old man stroked it as if that would remind it of dignity. "Something colder than what we have learned will move now," Eamon said after a measured silence. "They haven't the language. They will use ours. Be prepared to have your words turned against you. That is the first tactic of winter." John went to Frostfire and put his hands on the creature in rhythmic strokes as if he could teach his own heart how to beat in a war that had changed its terms. The dragon's eyes met his and held and then moved away, not denying him, only reminding him that what was coming would ask them both to become the kinds of creatures they had not yet tried. Frightened John, and the fear came like the old name he had been given and the new one he had learned, both in his throat like smoke. He stood long enough that men forgot to stop and stare. The night gathered itself and then shook. Somewhere in that great white dark, beyond the limits of maps and oaths, something angled its head as if listening. The wall made its noise again, rich and enormous. John felt the favor under his glove scrape his skin. He counted to 3. He counted again. He looked at the map in his head, the river and the sandbar and the door, and pushed a small stone in his mind 1 inch. He did not know yet what would be changed by that inch. He knew only that moving it was correct. He went to find Mormont because the second kind of courage is going to tell an old man the shape of the new danger. He took Ghost with him. He found the Lord Commander at the table with a candle that had been burning too long and had become a sculpture of itself. Outside, the wind hauled itself up for a new attempt against the great ice. Inside, the map waited, hills and rivers and ambitions flat as bread waiting for heat. John was not a king. He was a hinge and a boy and a dragon's rider and a man's son and a mother's son and a brother and a liar in the 2 or 3 useful ways. He had the cold. He had the heat. His hands were empty and then full. He set them on the edge of the table and said, "It begins." And the candle nodded, and the old man did not waste the obvious by asking, "What?"